Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Victor Laskovich, and I have spent most of my life trying to forget what happened in that house. I grew up in a quiet town in northern Poland, where winters were harsh and the nights stretched long and cold. Our house sat at the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place that always seemed a little too dark, even in the middle of the day. It had been in our family for generations, an old creaking structure with walls that whispered when the wind blew. My mother always said it had character, but to me, it had something else, something unseen, something watching. I was 5 years old the first time I realized our house was not just a house. It was late, maybe past midnight, when I woke up with an odd feeling in my chest. Not fear, not yet, just an uneasiness, like something wasn't quite right. The air in my room felt thick and the shadows seemed deeper than usual. I lay there listening. At first there was only silence. Then, scrape. A slow, deliberate sound like wood dragging across the floor. I sat up, my tiny hands gripping the blanket. The sound came again. Scrape, scrape. Closer this time. My heart pounded against my ribs as I strained to hear. Then came the voice. Soft, almost gentle, but not familiar. Victor. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't my mother's. It had a whispery quality to it, like someone speaking through a cold draft. I couldn't move. My 5-year-old brain tried to reason with what I was hearing. Maybe it was my mother calling me. Maybe my name had only been the wind. But then scrape. And I knew it was neither of those things. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. The hallway outside was dark, lit only by the faintest glow from the nightlight plugged into the wall. My parents' room was down the hall, but I didn't call for them, because part of me was terrified they wouldn't answer. The dining room was at the end of the hallway, just out of sight. The scraping sound had stopped, but I knew whatever had been making it was still there. I peered around the corner, barely breathing. And then I saw it. A dining chair. Slowly, steadily, it was moving on its own. I could hear the wood grating against the floor, see the subtle shake as it slid an inch, then another. It wasn't fast or jerky, just a slow, deliberate pull. I gasped. Instantly, the chair stopped. And then, footsteps. Not heavy like my father's. Not light like my mother's, just soft and slow, coming toward me. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, sprinting straight into my mother's room and diving under the covers beside her. She stirred, mumbling something about bad dreams, but I didn't argue. I just lay there staring at the door, waiting. Nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear and I fell asleep. But I never forgot. And deep down, I knew. Whatever had been there that night, whatever had whispered my name, wasn't just my imagination. Something had been in that dining room, and it knew I had seen it. Years passed, but the memory of that night never truly faded. By the time I was 12, I had learned to push it to the back of my mind. I told myself that maybe I had been half asleep, that the shadows and the wind had played tricks on me. That's what I wanted to believe. But deep down, I knew better. That night had been real, and whatever had been in our house had never truly left. It was mid-autumn when the storm hit, the kind of storm that rattled windows and made the trees bend like old men against the wind. Our parents had gone to visit our grandmother in the next town over, leaving me, my older brother Marek, and my younger sister Kazia alone for the night. We had been through storms before, but this one was different. It started with the sky turning a deep bruised purple, thick clouds swallowing the last traces of daylight. By the time the rain came, it was already dark and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. I sat curled on the couch trying to focus on my book, while Marek flipped through TV channels, bored. Kasia sat cross-legged on the floor, brushing the mane of one of her dolls. She was only 8, still too young to sense the tension in the air. "You're both acting scared," Marek said suddenly, smirking as he stretched out on the couch. "It's just a storm." "I'm not scared," I muttered. But even as I said it, I felt a strange unease creeping in. Kasia ignored him, humming softly as she continued brushing her doll's hair. A crack of thunder shook the house and I jumped. Marek laughed. "Wow, Victor, you're such a baby." "Shut up," I snapped. "You know, ghosts aren't real," he continued, as if I had argued otherwise. "You two probably still believe in monsters under the bed." I didn't respond. I didn't want to talk about ghosts. Not in this house, not in the middle of a storm. Marek grinned, sensing an opportunity to mess with us. "There was a woman who died in this house, you know," he said, lowering his voice like he was telling a campfire story. "A long time ago. That's why it creaks at night. Her spirit is still here, walking around, moving things." "Stop it," Kasia mumbled, hugging her doll to her chest. Marek chuckled. "Come on, it's fun. If ghosts were real, they'd have shown themselves by now, right?" Just as the words left his mouth, the power went out. The TV snapped off, plunging the room into thick, suffocating darkness. The storm still raged outside, the wind screaming through the trees, but inside the house everything was too quiet. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Kasia whimpered, clutching my arm. "It's fine," Marek said, but his voice was different now, less amused. "I'll go check the fuse box." I reached out in the dark, my hands fumbling until I found the flashlight we kept near the couch. Clicking it on, I cast a shaky beam of light across the room. Everything looked normal, but somehow wrong. Like the house was waiting. Marek hesitated before heading toward the hallway. His bravado had slipped just enough for me to notice. He didn't like this either. I turned the flashlight toward Kasia, her wide eyes reflecting the glow. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "The lights will come back soon." She nodded, but her grip on my sleeve didn't loosen. Then, a sound. At first I thought it was the storm, but then I heard it more clearly. A whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain. "Victor." I stiffened. My mouth went dry. It was the same voice, the same woman's voice. Kasia's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" I could barely nod. Then from the hallway, a crash. Marek yelled, followed by the sound of something heavy slamming into the wall. I jumped up, dragging Kasia with me, and ran toward the hallway. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as we turned the corner. Marek was on the floor, staring at the open fuse box, his face pale. "The door," he whispered, his voice shaking. It slammed on its own." I felt cold all over. The fuse box door was made of solid metal. It didn't just swing open or shut, it had to be pulled hard. Something had thrown it shut. Marek met my eyes. For the first time in his life, my older brother looked afraid. And at that moment I knew. He believed me now. The air in the hallway felt different now. Thicker, charged with something unseen. Marek was still on the floor, his chest rising, and falling too fast, his hands braced against the wooden boards as if he needed to steady himself. I stood frozen in place, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. Kasia was behind me, small and silent, her little hands fisted in the back of my shirt. For a long time, none of us spoke. The only sound was the storm outside, rain hammering against the roof, wind whistling through the trees. The power was still out, the house still shrouded in darkness, but something about this moment felt worse than just losing electricity. Marek finally pushed himself up, swallowing hard. It was the wind," he stammered, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. I turned my flashlight toward the fuse box. The metal door was shut, but the dent in the drywall next to it told me exactly how hard it had slammed. There was no way a breeze could have done that. A breeze also wouldn't have whispered my name. Kasia tugged at my sleeve. "I want to go to Mom's room," she murmured. I nodded, feeling a desperate need to get away from the hallway. "Come on." Marek hesitated. "Wait," he said, clearing his throat. "We should fix the power first." I shot him a look. "You really want to stand here in the dark after what just happened?" He didn't answer, just clenched his jaw and glanced back at the fuse box. I could tell he wanted to fix it, to do something that would make him feel in control again, but he also wasn't stupid. He was scared. So we left the hallway behind and made our way toward our parents' bedroom. The flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beam weak and flickering as I led the way. The storm outside rattled the windows, casting strange, moving shadows along the walls. Each step felt slower than the last, like walking through thick, invisible water. When we reached the bedroom, I pushed the door open and quickly swept the flashlight across the room. Nothing looked out of place. The bed was neatly made, their nightstand lamp still off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kasia climbed onto the bed without hesitation, curling up against the pillows. I felt a pang of guilt for dragging her through this. She was too little to understand what was happening. But she wasn't stupid. She knew something wasn't right. Marek lingered near the door, arms crossed. "We can't just sit here all night." I ignored him, walking toward the window. Our parents' car was nowhere in sight. They were still at Grandma's, stuck on the other side of the storm. That meant we were completely alone. The rain streaked down the glass in long, thin lines, blurring the view outside. I stared out at the trees, their black shapes bending under the wind. And then, a shape moved. My heart nearly stopped. At first I thought it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind, but then I saw it again. A figure standing just at the edge of the forest. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could feel it watching. I took a step back, my pulse hammering. "Marek," I whispered. He glanced up. "What?" "There's someone outside." He was next to me in an instant, shoving me aside to peer through the window. His breath caught. I knew he saw it too. For several agonizing seconds, we just stared. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't step back, just stood there. Then, without warning, it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. Marek cursed under his breath and grabbed my arm. "We're locking all the doors." I nodded, barely able to breathe. We had grown up in this house. We had spent our whole lives playing in the yard, running through the trees, never once feeling unsafe. But right now, with the power out and something lurking in the darkness, home didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a trap. Marek moved fast. He rushed past me into the hallway, his long legs carrying him toward the front door before I even had time to react. I grabbed Kasia's hand and hurried after him, the flashlight shaking in my grip as we moved through the dark house. The air inside felt heavier than before. It was the same house we had always lived in, the same wooden floors that creaked under our weight, the same old walls that held years of memories. But something about it felt wrong now, like we weren't supposed to be here. Marek reached the front door first and yanked on the handle. It didn't budge. He tried again, rattling it harder. Nothing. His voice was tight. "Did you lock this?" I shook my head. "No." His hands fumbled at the lock, twisting it back and forth. It was completely jammed. "The hell?" He gritted his teeth and yanked again. Nothing. The door wouldn't move an inch. Kasia whimpered beside me, her little fingers digging into my arm. "Victor." I turned to reassure her, but the words died in my throat. The window. Something had changed. I lifted the flashlight, my hands shaking, and aimed the beam at the glass. A cold, sick feeling crept up my spine. The rain was still falling in heavy sheets outside, streaking the window, distorting everything beyond it. But there, on the glass, was something new. A handprint, not from the inside, from the outside. Marek saw it at the same time I did. "Get away from the window," he muttered. I didn't move. I couldn't. The print was smudged, the fingers long and uneven. Too long, too thin. Like whatever had touched the glass wasn't quite human. Marek grabbed my shoulder and shoved me back. Move! Kasia started crying. I barely registered any of it because in that moment, just as Marek pulled me away, the handprint faded. Not from the rain, not from movement, it just disappeared like it had never been there at all. Marek backed away, his breath uneven. I turned toward the hallway, toward the rest of the house. My gut told me we weren't safe here. The front door wouldn't open, but maybe the back door. A sound stopped me in my tracks. A slow, deliberate creak. Not from the storm, not from the house settling, from inside. It came from down the hallway toward the dining room. The same place where years ago I had seen the chair move. The same place where I had first heard the voice, and then so soft I almost didn't hear it. Victor. The same whisper. The same voice. But this time, it wasn't coming from far away. It was right behind me. A cold breath ghosted against the back of my neck. My entire body locked up. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't breathe. The whisper had been right there, inches from me. Too close, too real. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my legs wouldn't listen. Marek grabbed my arm and yanked me backward, nearly knocking me off my feet. The flashlight slipped from my grip and hit the floor, spinning wildly. Its beam swept across the hallway, illuminating something for the briefest second. A shadow. Tall, thin, wrong. It wasn't standing like a person. Its body was slightly hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as if it were listening. The light flickered. The shadow moved. Marek cursed and shoved me toward the kitchen. Go! Now! I grabbed Kasia's hand and ran. She was crying, struggling to keep up, but I didn't let go. Behind us, I heard Marek fumbling with something. Maybe the fallen flashlight, maybe the front door again. I didn't know. We barreled into the kitchen, nearly slipping on the tile. The back door was just ahead. I lunged for the handle and twisted. It wouldn't open, just like the front door. The lock turned, the knob twisted, but the door wouldn't budge. A low creak came from the hallway behind us. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Marek ran in a second later, slamming the door behind him. The windows, he gasped. Try the windows. I grabbed the nearest one, my fingers slipping against the latch. The storm outside was still raging, wind and rain, pounding against the glass, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. The latch moved. For a brief second, hope flared in my chest. Then, bang. Something hit the window from the outside. Hard. I staggered back, yanking Kasia with me. The entire glass pane shook, but it didn't shatter. My heart pounded as I tried to see through the rain. There was nothing there. Nothing visible, anyway. Marek grabbed my arm. Forget it. The basement. There's an old window down there. Maybe we can crawl out. The basement. I didn't want to go down there. The idea of being underground, trapped in the dark, made my stomach churn. But we had no choice. We sprinted toward the basement door, Marek yanking it open. The wooden steps led downward into blackness. No windows, no light, just deep, suffocating dark. Kasia clung to me, whimpering. We have to go, Marek said. A sound drifted from the hallway. Not footsteps, not a whisper. Breathing. Shallow, ragged, right outside the kitchen door. Marek pushed me forward. Go, go! I didn't hesitate. I practically dragged Kasia down the stairs, my pulse hammering in my ears. Marek followed, slamming the door shut behind us. The basement was freezing, damp air curling around us like fingers. I could barely see, but I felt my way along the walls, searching for the small, dusty window near the ceiling. Marek pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The weak glow revealed shelves lined with old boxes, cobwebs hanging from the beams. The tiny window was there, covered in grime, but intact. We can fit through that, Marek breathed. He grabbed an old chair and shoved it beneath the window. Help me open it. I reached up, fingers scrabbling against the glass. It was stiff, barely moving. Then, from upstairs, slow, deliberate footsteps, crossing the kitchen, moving toward the basement door. Kasia sobbed against my chest. Marek cursed under his breath. Faster. I shoved harder. The window gave an inch, then another. Cold wind rushed in, sending a shiver through my body. A soft knock came from the basement door. Marek and I both froze. The knock came again, 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. We didn't move. A pause. Then, the handle turned. Marek didn't wait. He grabbed Kasia and hoisted her up toward the window. Climb through. She hesitated, but I helped push her. Her small frame wiggled through the opening, and a second later she was gone, disappearing into the storm outside. I turned to Marek. The basement door was opening, not quickly, not forcefully, slowly, carefully, like something wanted us to see. Marek shoved me toward the window. Your turn. I scrambled onto the chair and pulled myself up. The cold air bit at my skin as I wriggled through the tight space, my heart hammering. As I twisted to pull myself free, I made the mistake of glancing back. The basement door was fully open now, and something stood in the doorway. Tall, thin, its head still tilted like it was listening. I didn't see its face. I didn't want to see. Marek grabbed my arm and shoved me through the window. I hit the wet grass outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Kasia was beside me, crying. A second later, Marek pulled himself through. We didn't stop to think. We ran. We didn't stop running until we reached the neighbor's house half a mile away. When they opened the door and saw the terror on our faces, they didn't ask questions. They just let us inside. The storm raged on through the night, and when morning finally came, our parents returned. The power was back. The doors worked again. Nothing was out of place. No handprints. No whispering. Like nothing had ever happened. But we knew the truth. Something had been in that house, and it had let us know it was never really empty. I had always considered myself a cautious person. Not paranoid, just careful. The kind of person who kept their keys wedged between their fingers when walking through a dimly lit parking lot, who glanced over their shoulder every now and then, just to make sure no one was too close. I wasn't naive. I knew the world wasn't as safe as I wanted it to be, but that night was different. It was late, later than usual as I made my way home. The city had quieted to a low hum, the streets mostly empty aside from the occasional passing car. The air was crisp, tinged with the lingering scent of rain, and the streetlights buzzed faintly overhead. I had taken this route dozens of times before, enough that I could walk it on autopilot. A straight shot down 3 blocks, then a left onto my street. Easy, safe, or so I thought. It wasn't until I turned onto the second block that I noticed him. The man in dark clothing. At first, I wasn't even sure why he caught my attention. He was just a man, dressed in dark clothing, walking in the same direction as me. Maybe a little too far behind to be a coincidence, but not close enough to be an immediate threat. He wasn't running. He wasn't calling out to me. Still, something about him sent a prickle of unease down my spine. I told myself not to be ridiculous. People walk at night all the time. Just because someone happens to be going the same way doesn't mean they're following you. But then I picked up my pace, and so did he. The increasing fear. I could feel it now, the undeniable tension creeping into my muscles, the rapid thud of my heart against my ribs. I stole another glance over my shoulder, trying to be subtle about it. He was closer, not running, not even speed walking, just closing the distance. I swallowed hard, forcing my steps to remain steady, purposeful. If I ran, I'd only confirm what I was afraid of. If I panicked, I might make myself an easier target. My apartment was only a few blocks away. If I could just get there, just reach my door before he did, I'd be fine. I kept walking, and so did he. Acting normal. I tried to calm myself with logic. Maybe he was just walking home. Maybe I was imagining things, letting my fear get the best of me. If I turned onto my street and he kept going, I'd laugh about it tomorrow. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Deep down, I knew. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder, making it look like I wasn't paying attention. But I was. I could hear his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, always just far enough away to be almost normal. Almost. I resisted, the urge to check over my shoulder again. If he was following me, I didn't want him to know I knew. I just had to get home. Reaching my street, I turned onto my block, my breath caught in my throat. For a split second, hope flared in my chest. Maybe he'd keep walking straight. Maybe this was all in my head. Then his footsteps turned too. Panic surged through me. He was following me. I picked up my pace, my keys already in my hand. My apartment building was just ahead. I could see the entrance, the glass doors gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the lobby. 50 feet, 40, 30. His footsteps were faster now. So were mine. The final sprint, I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted the last stretch to my building, my breath ragged, my heartbeat hammering so hard it drowned out every other sound. My keys fumbled in my grip as I reached the door, hands shaking. I yanked it open. Then I slammed it shut behind me. The locked door. I locked it, bolted it, pressed my back against the cool glass, gasping for air. Outside, under the streetlight, he stood, just a few feet away. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel him staring, not moving, not walking away, just watching. I stumbled back, pulling my phone from my pocket with trembling fingers. The police. I needed to call the police. But before I could dial, he turned. Without a word, without hesitation, he simply walked away, like he had never been there at all. The queer. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Even after he was gone, my body refused to relax. My mind kept replaying the moment. The footsteps, the turning, the silent, knowing way. He had watched me. I finally forced myself upstairs to my apartment, locked the door, checked the windows, checked them again. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the building made me flinch. Every passing car sent a fresh wave of fear through my chest. Even though I was home, I didn't feel safe. And I had the awful, gut-wrenching feeling that whoever he was, whatever he wanted, he wasn't finished yet. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing under the streetlight, just watching. The way he never spoke, never moved closer, just waited. It was worse than if he had chased me. A person running at you meant immediate danger, but this was something else, something patient. By the time morning light spilled through my blinds, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts sluggish. I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water scald the fear from my skin. I told myself it was over, that he was gone, that I was safe. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That day, I went about my routine as usual. Work, errands, normal things. I wasn't going to let fear control me. If I let one bad night get inside my head, I'd never feel normal again. But when I stepped outside my apartment building, I hesitated. The street felt different. Not visibly, everything looked the same. The same cars parked along the curb, the same old man walking his dog down the block. But something was off. I couldn't explain it. The feeling settled into my stomach like a stone. I shook it off and kept walking. It wasn't until later that evening, on my way home from work, that I saw him again. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I had been hyper-aware all day, scanning every face in the crowd, every shadow between parked cars. Maybe I had freaked myself out so much that I was starting to see him where he wasn't. But then I looked again, and there he was, standing on the opposite side of the street near the corner store, not moving, not looking at his phone, just there, watching. My breath hitched. This wasn't normal. This wasn't coincidence. I forced myself to keep walking, my pulse hammering. Don't run. Don't look back. Just get inside. I turned onto my block, my hands gripping my keys so tightly the metal dug into my palm. The air felt heavy, like a storm pressing down on me. I was almost home. I just had to get inside. I rushed through the front door of my building, heart pounding. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I felt a little safer. Not completely. My nerves were still raw, but at least there were people around. A couple by the mailboxes, an older woman heading toward the elevators. I exhaled, forcing myself to slow down. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressing my floor number. The doors started to close. Then a hand shot out. For a brief stomach-dropping second, I thought it was him. But it wasn't. It was someone else. A man, middle-aged, wearing a worn-out hoodie. His face was forgettable, the kind you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But something about him felt wrong. He stepped inside without looking at me. Didn't press a floor number. Didn't speak. I swallowed, shifting toward the corner of the elevator. "What floor?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. He just stood there. The air inside the elevator felt too small, too tight. The doors slid shut and we began to rise. My skin prickled with unease. I reached for my phone, pretending to check my messages, but my fingers trembled too much to type anything. The elevator dinged as we passed the second floor, then the third. Still, he hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. I forced myself to breathe slowly. If I panicked, it would only make things worse. Maybe he was just out of it. Maybe he was drunk, or tired, or lost in thought, or maybe he was waiting. The doors opened to my floor. I stepped out quickly, hoping, praying, that he would stay inside. He didn't. I could hear his footsteps behind me as I walked down the hall. Not rushing, not slowing, just following. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that he was just a neighbor, that I was overreacting, but I knew better. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys. The metal jingled loudly in the silence of the hallway. Come on. Come on. Finally, the key slid into the lock. I turned the knob, pushing the door open. Then, I shoved myself inside and slammed it shut behind me. Locked it, bolted it. My breath came in sharp gasps. My pulse pounded in my ears. I pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. He was gone. I stayed by the door for a long time, trying to convince myself that everything was okay. But something about it didn't sit right. The man in the hoodie, he wasn't the same man from the street. He wasn't the one who had followed me home last night, which meant there were two of them. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I could think of. Ben, my best friend, answered after the second ring. "What's up?" he asked, his voice groggy. "I think someone's following me," I whispered. Silence. Then, more alert. "Where are you?" "I'm home, but My voice wavered. I took a breath, gripping the phone tighter. I saw him again, and then this other guy, he got in the elevator with me. He followed me to my door. Ben didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over." I exhaled shakily. Okay. I sat on the couch, facing the door, waiting. Every tiny noise from outside made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud. The ticking clock felt like a countdown. I checked the locks again, and again. A soft tap echoed from the hallway. My heart nearly stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. Then faintly, footsteps, slow, deliberate, passing my door, then stopping. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my phone. Then the footsteps started again and faded away. I let out a shaking breath. By the time Ben arrived, I had checked the peephole at least a dozen times, but the hallway remained empty. I let him in, locking the door behind him. "You're staying here tonight," he said firmly. I didn't argue, because deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. I barely spoke as Ben set his bag down and locked the door behind him. He didn't ask for details right away. He could see it on my face, the exhaustion, the fear, the way I kept glancing at the peephole as if expecting to see him standing outside. Instead, he just sat down on the couch next to me, rubbing his hands together. "All right," he said after a moment. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the man from the night before, the one in dark clothing who had followed me all the way to my building, the way he had just stood there under the streetlight staring. Then I told him about today, the man in the elevator, the way he hadn't pressed a button, hadn't spoken, the way I had felt his eyes on me the entire time, even though he barely looked at me. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist in knots just thinking about it, was that they were different people. Ben exhaled sharply, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You think they're working together?" I swallowed. "I don't know, but what are the chances of two strangers acting like that, following me on back-to-back days?" Ben didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his hair, his usual easygoing expression nowhere to be found. "Did you call the police?" I hesitated. "No." "Why not?" I let out a bitter laugh. What would I even say? "Hi. Two men have been following me, but they haven't actually done anything, so there's nothing you can arrest them for. They tell me to be careful and call back if something happened, that's it." Ben clenched his jaw. He knew I was right. After a few minutes, Ben stood up. "Come on." I blinked. "Where?" "We're checking the security cameras." My stomach twisted. The idea of seeing them again, proof that they were real, that I wasn't just losing my mind, made my skin crawl. But I needed to know. So I grabbed my keys and we made our way downstairs. My apartment building wasn't fancy, but it had a small security office near the lobby. A middle-aged guy named Victor worked the night shift, and I had talked to him a few times in passing. He always had a cup of coffee in his hand and the news playing on a tiny, outdated TV. When we walked in, he looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, then forced myself to nod. "Yeah, something weird happened today, and I was wondering if we could check the cameras." Victor frowned. "Weird how?" I swallowed hard. I think someone's been following me." His expression darkened. He gestured to the screen. "What time?" I told him about last night, then about today. He rewound the footage, the grainy black and white images flickering across the screen. Then we saw him, the man from last night. He was exactly where I remembered, walking a few paces behind me as I approached the building, stopping when I reached the door. Standing, under the streetlight staring, Victor muttered a curse under his breath. "Creepy son of a bitch." Ben leaned in. "Can you zoom in?" Victor clicked a few buttons, bringing the man's face into sharper focus. My stomach turned. I had been right. He wasn't just watching. His face was blank, expressionless. But his eyes, they were locked onto me. I forced myself to look away. "Check today." Victor fast-forwarded. We watched as I walked into the lobby, heading for the elevator. And then, the man in the hoodie appeared. He walked in from the street, glancing around once before stepping inside. His movements were slow, almost too casual. He didn't check the mailboxes, didn't look at the front desk. He just stood there like he was waiting for something. Then the elevator doors opened, and he got in after me. A chill ran down my spine. Victor clicked again, switching to the hallway camera on my floor. The moment the doors opened, I stepped out, moving quickly. And the man? He followed. He kept the same distance between us, never closing in, never slowing down. Then I reached my door. And the moment it shut behind me, he stopped. Just stood there. For 5 full seconds. Then without a word, he turned and walked back toward the elevator. Victor let out a low whistle. "That's not normal." Ben exhaled. "Yeah, no shit." I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the sickening feeling crawling up my throat. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just bad luck. 2 men, 2 nights, and I had no idea what they wanted. Ben didn't give me a choice this time. "We're calling the cops," he said firmly. "This is enough to make a report." And for once, I didn't argue. I let him make the call while I sat in Victor's chair, staring blankly at the footage still frozen on the screen. The officers arrived 20 minutes later, a man and a woman, both looking tired but professional. They took our statements, asked the usual questions. Had they tried to talk to me? No. Had they threatened me? No. Had they made any physical contact? No. The male officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's unsettling, sure, but without a direct threat or a pattern of harassment, there's not much we can do." I swallowed hard. "What about the footage? That's enough proof, isn't it?" The female officer nodded. "It's definitely concerning. We'll make a report and keep a record of it. But legally, unless they actually do something, our hands are tied." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the answer I had expected. Ben pressed his lips into a thin line. "What do you suggest?" The female officer looked at me. "Change your routine. Walk different routes home. Stay in well-lit areas. And if you see either of them again, call us immediately." I nodded, numb. They left soon after, and Ben turned to me. "You're staying at my place tonight." I didn't argue. I didn't want to be alone. As we walked back upstairs to grab my overnight bag, a thought struck me. "What if they want me to change my routine?" I whispered. Ben frowned. "What do you mean?" I swallowed. "The advice. The officers said to change my routine, walk a different route. But what if that's what they want?" Ben's face darkened. "Because if I changed my routine, if I took a different route home, there was one thing the police wouldn't be able to track: where I went, and who followed me." Ben's apartment was only a 15-minute drive from mine, but that night it felt like a world away. I kept glancing out the window, scanning the streets for anyone, anything that felt out of place. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A shadow moving between parked cars, a familiar shape under a streetlight. I just knew I needed to see it coming. But nothing happened. The city kept moving like it always did. Cars idling at stop signs, late-night joggers passing by, a man outside a liquor store smoking a cigarette. Just another regular night. Except it wasn't. Not for me. For me, the night felt too open, too vulnerable, like the moment I let my guard down. Something would reach out from the dark and pull me in. Ben noticed. "You're gonna drive yourself crazy," he said, cutting through the silence. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze back inside. "I know." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." I nodded. I wanted to believe him. But the fear had already settled too deep. I tried to sleep. Ben gave me his bed, insisting he'd take the couch, but no matter how many times I flipped my pillow to the cool side, sleep wouldn't come. I was too aware of everything. The faint ticking of the wall clock, the distant hum of cars outside, the occasional creak of the building settling. Every sound felt too much, like something creeping closer. I reached for my phone, checking the time. 2:13 a.m. I sighed and turned over, staring at the ceiling. Then, a noise. A soft tap at the window. My breath caught in my throat. Ben's apartment was on the 3rd floor. I slowly sat up, my pulse hammering. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that maybe a branch had hit the glass, but I knew better. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing. Then, just as I started to relax, tap, tap. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stop the sound that almost escaped my throat. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was out there, but I had to. Heart pounding, I turned my head toward the window and froze. There was someone standing outside, or at least something shaped like a person. I could barely make out the silhouette in the dim glow of the streetlights below, but the figure was there. Still, silent, waiting. And somehow, even from a distance, I knew they were looking at me, watching. The darkness obscured their face, but their posture was unmistakable. They weren't just standing randomly outside an apartment building. They were here for me. I forced myself to move, slipping out of bed and creeping toward the living room. My hands were shaking as I shook Ben's shoulder. He groaned, turning over. "What?" "There's someone outside." Those 3 words woke him up instantly. He was on his feet in seconds, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before moving to the window. I hovered near the doorway, every muscle in my body tensed. Ben pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. Then he swore under his breath. "What do we do?" I whispered. Ben exhaled sharply, then reached for his phone. "I'm calling the cops." The dispatcher kept Ben on the phone while we waited, asking the usual questions. Was the person attempting to break in? No. Did they have a weapon? We couldn't tell. Had we seen them before? I hesitated. I thought I had, but I wasn't sure. Not in the way that mattered. I kept pacing near the doorway, my stomach twisting itself into knots. Ben stayed by the window, watching. Then he muttered, "They're leaving." I froze. What? They just walked away. I ran to the window and looked out. The street below was empty. No shadow. No figure. Like they had never been there at all. But I knew they had been. I could still feel it. That awful, unshakable feeling of being watched. By the time the police arrived, the street was quiet. 2 officers, a man and a woman, took our statements. They asked the same questions as before, and Ben told them what he had seen. The male officer frowned. "You're sure it wasn't just someone passing by?" Ben shot him a look. "People don't just stand there at 3 a.m. staring up at 3rd-floor windows." The officer sighed and scribbled something down. "We'll make a report, but there's nothing you can do." I finished for him, my voice hollow. He hesitated. "We can increase patrols in the area. Keep an eye out." I nodded, but it didn't make me feel any better. Because whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they weren't random. They were after me. The next morning, Ben insisted on driving me home. I didn't argue. When we pulled up to my building, everything looked normal. No strange figures lurking, no signs of anything being tampered with. But my body still screamed at me not to go inside. Ben must have noticed because he parked and turned to me. "You don't have to stay here." I swallowed hard. I can't avoid my own apartment forever. "Why not?" He half smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "I've got a couch. You've seen worse." I gave a weak laugh. "Thanks, but I need to at least grab some stuff." Ben sighed but didn't argue. "Fine, but I'm coming with you." We walked inside together. Every step down the hallway felt too long, too loud. I reached my door, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. I unlocked it, pushed it open, and froze. The air felt wrong, like a stranger had been in the room, touching things, leaving behind an invisible weight. Ben must have sensed it too because he stepped in front of me, scanning the apartment. "Stay here." He moved through the space carefully, checking every room, every closet, every possible place someone could hide. Nothing. But I knew. The throw blanket on my couch was slightly askew. A kitchen cabinet I never used was open, just an inch. And worst of all, on my kitchen table, sitting right in the center, was a single black glove. Ben's face went pale when he saw it. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. I already knew what it meant. It was a message. They had been here, and they wanted me to know. For a long time, neither of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the black glove on my kitchen table. It was a simple object, worn leather, a little stiff, like it had been left out in the cold too long. But it might as well have been a knife pressed against my throat, because it wasn't mine, because someone had put it there, and because it meant that I hadn't imagined it. They had been inside my home. I could feel it now, that crawling sensation along my skin, that invisible presence lingering in the air like the walls had absorbed a stranger's breath. Ben was the first to speak. "Get your stuff," he said, his voice low and tight. "We're leaving." I grabbed a duffel bag and stuffed it, with whatever I could. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, anything important. My hands shook the entire time. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to turn and find someone standing in the doorway. Ben stayed on the phone with the police, his voice clipped, controlled. He told them exactly what we had found, that we hadn't touched the glove, that I hadn't been home all night. But I already knew what they were going to say. No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. No actual crime committed. Just another report in their system. Another warning to stay vigilant and keep my doors locked. Like locks had stopped them before. Before we left, Ben had an idea. "Wait here," he said, disappearing down the hall. I sat on the edge of my couch, my legs bouncing, staring at the glove without really seeing it. When Ben came back, he was holding something small, one of those tiny indoor security cameras. "I bought this a while ago but never set it up," he muttered, unboxing it quickly. "We'll hide it somewhere they won't notice." I nodded, too numb to argue. We positioned it high on a shelf, angled toward the entrance, and connected it to my phone. A motion alert would notify me if anything happened while I was gone. Then we locked up and left. Back at Ben's apartment, I sat on his couch, staring at my phone, waiting, watching the screen for any movement in my apartment. But nothing happened. No notifications, no shadow crossing the camera's view. Nothing. Ben sat beside me, his arms crossed. "I don't get it. Why go through all the trouble of following you, breaking in, leaving something behind, and then just disappear?" I shook my head. "I don't know. But I had a theory. I didn't say it out loud because it sounded crazy, but what if this wasn't about breaking in? What if this wasn't about robbery or violence or anything I could understand? What if this was about control? A slow, suffocating game where fear itself was the weapon?" I shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around me. Ben exhaled. "You should try to sleep." I laughed, hollow and humorless. "Yeah, right." Neither of us slept. By morning, my body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry. Ben had fallen asleep at some point, slumped on the couch, but I hadn't even closed my eyes. And then, my phone buzzed. I jumped so hard I almost dropped it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. A motion alert. Something had triggered the camera. Ben sat up as soon as he saw my face. "What?" I didn't answer. I just tapped the notification and opened the live feed. For a moment I thought there was nothing. The camera view showed my empty apartment, the dim light from the curtains, the same stillness as before. Then I noticed it. The glove was gone, and in its place at the center of the table was a folded piece of paper. Ben swore under his breath. Jesus Christ. My hands trembled as I zoomed in, trying to make out the writing. 4 words written in thick, uneven letters. "You made the right choice." I couldn't breathe. Ben grabbed his keys. "We're going to the cops again." But I shook my head. I knew what they would say. The same thing they always said. No real threat. No direct harm. Nothing we can do. But the message wasn't a threat. It was a warning. They had wanted me to leave. And I had. I had done exactly what they wanted, and now they were done with me. I never went back to that apartment, not alone at least. A week later, I broke my lease and moved out, losing my security deposit but not caring. I didn't want to know who had been watching me. I didn't want to know how they had gotten inside. I just wanted to be gone. Ben helped me find a new place across town, a different neighborhood, a fresh start. For a while I still checked over my shoulder, still avoided walking alone at night, still kept the security camera in my new apartment just in case. But whoever they were, they never came back. Because they didn't have to. They had already won. They had gotten what they wanted. I was gone. I still don't know who they were. I don't know if it was two people working together or if there were more. I don't know why they chose me. But I do know this. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what someone does to you, it's what they make you do to yourself. I had always considered myself a rational person, the type who double-checks locked doors, avoids unnecessary risks, and never ignores their gut feeling. I wasn't the kind of person who got tangled up in weird situations. But that night changed everything. It started like any other exhausting evening. I had just finished a long shift at the diner, my feet aching and my brain foggy from too many hours spent on my feet. The usual post-shift routine played out the same way it always did, locking up, waving goodbye to my coworker, and walking across the dimly lit parking lot to my car. Except this time, something was different. The moment I opened my car door, I noticed it, a phone, sitting face up in the center console. I froze, my fingers still gripping the door handle. It wasn't mine. My own phone was in my pocket, and I knew that my car had been empty when I parked it that afternoon. So where the hell had this one come from? I hesitated before reaching for it, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and yell that it was a prank. But the parking lot was silent, just the hum of a streetlight buzzing overhead. Carefully, I picked it up. It was an older model, slightly scuffed. The screen cracked at the corner. The battery was low but still alive. And on the lock screen, there were several missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. Unknown number. Unknown number. Unknown number. I felt a strange chill crawl down my spine. Maybe someone had dropped it. Maybe they had left it in my car by mistake. But that didn't make sense. My car had been locked. And even if it hadn't been, who just leaves their phone inside a stranger's vehicle? Something about it felt wrong. I sat in the driver's seat, closing the door behind me, but didn't start the engine. Instead, I pressed the power button on the phone, bringing up the lock screen. More notifications. A series of text messages, all from the same unknown number. I shouldn't have looked. I should have just taken the phone straight to the police. But curiosity won. And when I swiped to read the messages, my stomach dropped. Unknown number. Where is my phone? Unknown number. I know you have it. Unknown number. Give it back. Unknown number. You don't want to make this difficult. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever this was, they weren't just looking for a lost phone, they knew someone had it. And they were angry. I looked around the parking lot again, suddenly feeling exposed. The streetlights cast long shadows stretching across the pavement. My car was the only one left. I was alone. But was I? I locked the doors. A rational person, someone who wasn't, exhausted, stressed, and running on fumes, would have turned the phone off and ignored it. Maybe even tossed it in the glove compartment and forgotten about it until morning. But something about those messages made my skin crawl. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? Hey, I found a phone in my car and someone's sending weird messages about it. They'd probably tell me to bring it in the next day if I was worried. Still, I had to do something. I took out my own phone and Googled what to do if you find a lost phone. Most of the advice was obvious. Check for emergency contacts, turn it into a police station. Leave it at the location where you found it. None of it was helpful. Then the unknown number texted again. Unknown number. If you don't answer, I will find you. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just someone looking for their lost phone anymore. This was a threat. I turned off the phone and shoved it into my bag, my hands shaking. Then, without wasting another second, I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. I needed to get home. The streets were quiet as I drove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror felt suspicious. Every red light stretched into an eternity. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I sat in the car for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to shake off the unease creeping through me. Then as I reached for my bag, my phone buzzed. Not the one in my bag, my phone. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. Unknown number. I felt my heart stop. The messages had been coming to the other phone, the one I had found. So, how the hell did they have my number? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my bag, both phones still inside, and bolted for my apartment. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place. My hands were shaking, so badly I could barely breathe. I dumped my bag onto the kitchen table, staring at the black screen of the unknown phone. Then, before I could think twice about it, I picked it up and turned it back on. The moment it powered up, a new message appeared. Unknown number. You should have answered. I turned the phone off again. Tomorrow I was taking it to the police. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care if they thought I was overreacting. Something wasn't right. And I had a terrible feeling. This wasn't over. I barely slept that night. Even with my bedroom door locked, even with my phone on silent, I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for another vibration, another sign that whoever this was wasn't finished. At some point, exhaustion won. But my dreams weren't restful. I kept seeing the phone lighting up in the dark, the words on the screen shifting and twisting, forming messages I couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant to frighten me. When I finally woke up, it was to the sound of my own phone buzzing. I shot up, heart pounding. Unknown number. For a long moment, I just stared at it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned to the second phone, the one I had found, in my car. It was still where I had left it on the kitchen table, powered off, which meant whoever was texting me now had my actual number. I forced myself out of bed, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes. I needed to go to the police. That much was clear. But as I moved toward the kitchen, my phone buzzed again. Another message, then another. I finally unlocked the screen, my stomach twisting as I scrolled through the new texts. Unknown number. You should have answered. Unknown number. Ignoring me won't make me go away. Unknown number. I know where you live. A cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck. My apartment wasn't listed anywhere. My social media was private. I hadn't even told anyone about this yet except for Ben. So how the hell did they know where I lived? Then, as if they had read my mind, another message appeared. Unknown number. You left your car in space number 27. Nice place. I staggered back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. They had been here, standing in the parking lot watching, maybe while I was sleeping, maybe even before I got home last night. I needed help. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? I took a deep breath. Someone's been sending me threats. The woman on the other end of the line remained calm. Are you in immediate danger? I don't know, I admitted. I found a phone in my car last night. Then someone started texting my number saying they know where I live. I don't know who they are or what they want. A pause. Then, do you still have the phone you found? Yes. Where did you find it? In my car, but my car was locked. Another pause. Are you alone right now? I hesitated before answering. Yes. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe because saying it out loud made it real. The dispatcher's tone changed slightly, more serious. Stay inside, keep your doors locked. An officer is being dispatched to your location. Do not engage with this person if they contact you again. I exhaled shakily. Okay. She stayed on the line with me until I heard a knock at my door. The officer, a man in his 40s with a buzzed haircut and sharp eyes, introduced himself as Officer Reynolds. His expression remained unreadable as I told him everything, from the moment I found the phone to the moment I got the first text on my personal number. When I finished, he gestured to the black phone still sitting on my kitchen table. "May I?" I nodded. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Did you check for any contacts?" "I didn't want to unlock it," I admitted. "Whoever owns it, I don't want them to know I messed with it." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Smart." He pulled out a plastic evidence bag and slid the phone inside. "We'll take this in, see if we can trace it back to someone. But I'll be honest with you, without a direct threat or proof of who's sending the messages, there's not much we can do." I already knew that, but hearing it said out loud still made my stomach sink. "What should I do?" I asked. He studied me for a moment. Then, "Change your number. Be aware of your surroundings. And if you see anyone hanging around your apartment complex who looks suspicious, call us immediately." That was it. No real answers. No clear resolution, just be careful. It wasn't enough. After the police left, I followed Officer Reynolds' advice and changed my number. The process was easy enough, just a quick call to my provider, but it didn't make me feel safer, because whoever they were, they had already found me once. What was stopping them from finding me again? Still, days passed, then a week, and the messages stopped. No unknown numbers, no strange calls, no unsettling texts. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe turning in the phone had scared them off. Maybe they had moved on. I even started leaving my apartment at night again, taking my usual routes home from work without feeling like I needed to check over my shoulder every few seconds. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. It had been 10 days since the last message. I was in my car, parked outside my apartment, scrolling through my phone when a notification appeared. At first I thought it was a mistake, a glitch in my phone or a text from a number I had forgotten to save. But when I opened it, my stomach turned to ice. Unknown number. You thought this was over. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. A second message came almost immediately after. Unknown number. You changed your number, smart, but that won't help you. A cold dread settled in my chest. Whoever they were, they had found me again, and this time I wasn't sure I'd be so lucky. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at the screen. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. Long enough for the initial wave of panic to pass, leaving something colder in its place. A creeping realization that no matter what I did, no matter how careful I was, they had found me again. My hand shook as I locked my phone and shoved it into my pocket. My first instinct was to run straight to my apartment, bolt the door, and shut myself away from the world. But if they knew my number again, did they know where I was right now? Had they been watching me this whole time? A slow, suffocating fear curled in my chest. I scanned the parking lot through the windshield, my breath shallow. There were a few parked cars, but no movement. The streetlights cast long shadows, making it hard to tell if someone was lurking nearby. I needed to move. I needed to think. I needed to act like a person who wasn't about to completely lose their mind. I forced myself to breathe. Okay. If they were watching, running would only make it worse. I had to be calm. I had to act normal. With every ounce of willpower I had, I grabbed my bag, got out of the car, and walked toward my building like I wasn't completely unraveling inside. The weight of the phone in my pocket felt like a ticking bomb. Each step toward my apartment felt wrong, like I was leading something back with me. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. Then the deadbolt, then the chain. The second I was alone, I exhaled sharply, my knees nearly giving out beneath me. I was safe. For now. I knew I couldn't ignore this. Whoever this was, they had gone through the trouble of finding my new number. That meant effort. That meant intent. This wasn't just some random person messing with me. And what scared me most was that I still didn't know why. What the hell did they want? I pulled out my phone and stared at the messages again. Unknown. Number. You thought this was over? Unknown. Number. You changed your number. Smart. But that won't help. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. Ben picked up on the first ring. "Hey, what's up?" I didn't even try to hide the panic in my voice. "They found me again." A pause. Then, "What do you mean?" "I just got another text. Same thing, new number. They know I changed it. Ben, they found my number again." I heard rustling on the other end, like he was moving around. "Are you home?" "Yeah. I'm coming over." I let out a breath of relief. "Okay. Don't open the door for anyone but me. And don't answer any messages, screenshot everything." "Already did." "Good. I'll be there in 10. He hung up, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel completely alone. Ben arrived exactly when he said he would, knocking 3 times, our code from years ago to make sure it was really him. The moment I let him in, he locked the door behind him and gave me a long, serious look. "Show me." I handed him my phone, and he scrolled through the messages, his expression growing darker with each one. "This isn't random," he muttered. "No shit. I mean it. If they got your number again, it means they have access to something." He looked up at me. "Have you signed into any new apps lately? Used your number for anything?" I frowned, trying to think. "No, not that I can remember." Ben didn't look convinced. "Think harder," he pressed. "Any online orders? Any new subscriptions? Did you log into anything weird?" I started shaking my head, then stopped. Something did come to mind. "There was a call," I murmured. Ben narrowed his eyes. "What kind of call?" I hesitated. After I turned in the phone to the police, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a few days later. I thought maybe it was them following up, so I answered. "What did they say?" I swallowed. "Nothing. There was just breathing. And then they hung up." Ben's jaw clenched. "And you didn't think that was important?" "I didn't think..." I cut myself off, rubbing my forehead. "I don't know. I was trying to move on. I didn't want it to be important." Ben was already on his own phone, typing something. "I'm checking your number against online databases, see if it's been leaked anywhere." I stared at him. "That's a thing?" "It's always a thing," he muttered. "People sell information all the time, data breaches, scam sites, even social media leaks. If this person got your new number that fast, they either hacked something or they have inside access somewhere." I felt sick. Inside access to what? Ben didn't look up from his screen. "That's what we're going to find out." I paced while Ben worked, my skin crawling with unease. The apartment felt wrong. The locked door didn't feel like enough. The curtains weren't thick enough. The walls weren't solid enough. Then, my phone buzzed again. I nearly dropped it. Ben looked up sharply. "Don't answer." I didn't plan to, but I did look. And this time the message was different. "Unknown number. You're getting help." "That's good. Won't make a difference. Though." My blood ran cold. Ben snatched the phone from my hands and read it. His expression turned murderous. "Okay," he said, voice low. "Now they're watching." Something inside me snapped. For days I had been running, hiding, letting this unknown person dictate my every move. I was done. I turned to Ben, my pulse hammering. "We fight back." Ben's eyebrows lifted. "How?" I clenched my fists. "We find out who they are. We stop letting them control this." Ben stared at me for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." We worked through the night. Ben ran searches, checking data leaks and hidden information trails. I combed through every account I had, looking for signs of tampering. And finally, by dawn, we had a lead. A name, a location, a connection I hadn't expected, and the terrifying realization that whoever this was had been close to me all along. The name on the screen didn't make sense at first. Ben had found it buried in a database leak, one of those shady corners of the internet where stolen information ended up. My old number had been listed, along with the new one I just changed to. But what stood out wasn't just the fact that my information had been exposed. It was who had accessed it. Elliot Marshall. I stared at the name, my stomach twisting. I don't know an Elliot Marshall. Ben's face was grim. You do. Or at least, he knows you. He turned the laptop screen toward me, showing a list of activity logs tied to my number. Whoever Elliot Marshall was, he had pulled my information multiple times over the past few weeks. And the last activity? Just a few hours ago. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. This guy's been tracking me. Ben nodded. Not just tracking. He's been waiting. He could have contacted you at any time, but he let you think it was over first. That's calculated. I exhaled shakily, running a hand through my hair. So how do we find him? Ben clicked to another tab. I already did. The screen showed an old LinkedIn profile, barely filled out, no profile picture. Just a name, a vague job description, and a location, and that location made my skin crawl. He lives here, I whispered. Ben nodded. Not just in this city, 3 blocks from your apartment. A cold, sickening dread curled around my spine. Who was this guy? I racked my brain, trying to place the name. Had I served him at the diner? Passed him on the street? Was he one of those people you don't notice until suddenly they're everywhere? Ben leaned back, watching me carefully. You don't recognize him? I shook my head. No, but that doesn't mean anything. Ben's jaw tightened. Then we need to figure out why he's doing this. What does he want? I swallowed hard. How do we find that out? Ben gave me a look. We ask him. It was reckless. Probably stupid, but I was done waiting. We set up a fake number, one Ben controlled, disguised to look like it was mine. Then we sent a message. Fake me. Who are you? We didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, my real phone buzzed. Unknown number. You already know. Ben typed back on the fake number. Fake me. Elliot. Silence. Then finally, unknown number. So you did your homework. Ben and I exchanged a look. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't surprised that we had found him. If anything, he wanted us to. Ben typed again. Fake me. Why me? A longer pause. Then, unknown number. You still don't remember, do you? I stared at the screen, my heart hammering. What the hell does that mean? I whispered. Ben's expression darkened. It means this isn't random. Something about that made my stomach churn. I had been clinging to the hope that this was just bad luck, a stranger who picked me at random. But it wasn't. This was personal, and I had no idea why. Ben's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I've been waiting for you to notice me, but you never did. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Waiting? For me? I couldn't do this anymore. I needed to see him, to know who the hell was doing this. Before Ben could stop me, I grabbed my phone and texted him directly. Me. Tell me what you want. The reply came instantly. Unknown number. Come outside. I felt the blood drain from my face. Ben grabbed my wrist before I could move. Do not go out there. But I wasn't planning to. Instead, I sprinted to the yaw window and peeked through the blinds. The street below was mostly empty. Just a few parked cars, a couple walking their dog in the distance. But then I saw him. A man stood near the lamppost across the street. Not moving, not looking at his phone. Just waiting. My stomach turned to ice. It wasn't just some faceless stranger anymore, it was him. And for the first time I knew I had seen him before. It hit me all at once. A flash of memory, half-formed, blurry, from a night I hadn't thought about in years. A customer, at the diner, months ago, quiet, sat alone, always paid in cash. Never said much, but when he did, there was something off about the way he looked at me. I had written it off as nothing, but it hadn't been nothing to him. I turned to Ben, my throat tight. I do remember him. Ben's eyes widened. Who is he? I swallowed hard. A customer, just some guy who came in a few times. I never even talked to him more than I had to. Ben clenched his jaw. Then why the hell is he stalking you? I didn't have an answer, but I was about to find out. Ben called the police. I stayed by the window, watching. Elliot didn't move, didn't pace, didn't check his phone. He just stood there waiting. By the time the cops arrived, he was gone. They took my statement, asked for details. But without proof that he had actually done anything, there wasn't much they could do. Just another report, another warning to be careful. But I already knew being careful wasn't enough. This wasn't over. Not yet. That night, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let Elliot Marshall control my life. I wasn't going to live in fear, wondering when he'd show up next. I was going to end this, on my terms. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. Instead, I sat on Ben's couch watching the front door like I expected it to burst open at any second. My mind raced with everything I had learned. Elliot Marshall, a stranger who wasn't really a stranger. A man I had barely noticed, yet he had been watching me for who knows how long. The scariest part? I still had no idea why. Ben sat beside me, arms crossed, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows on his face. He had been searching every corner of the internet for more information, but there wasn't much. Elliot had almost no digital footprint, no social media, no public records beyond a vague job history. Just a name on a list of leaked phone numbers and a blurry, outdated LinkedIn profile, like he had been erasing himself, hiding in plain sight, until now. I clenched my fists. I want this to end. Ben looked up. Yeah, me too, but how? I swallowed hard. We make him show his hand. Ben raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. We bait him. If he thinks I'm alone, if he thinks I'm vulnerable, he'll make a move. Ben frowned. You want to provoke the guy who's been stalking you? I nodded. Yes. Because I was done hiding. The plan was simple. I'd go back to my apartment, act normal, let Elliot think I wasn't scared anymore, let him think I had let my guard down. And when he came for me, Ben would be waiting. We would have evidence, we would have proof. Something the police couldn't ignore. It was risky, it was reckless. But it was the only way to end this. Walking into my apartment felt wrong, like stepping into a crime scene before the crime had even happened. The air was thick with tension, my own heartbeat too loud in my ears. I forced myself to go through the motions, turned on the lights, set my keys down, checked my phone like I wasn't expecting another message. Ben was hidden in my bedroom, his phone camera ready to record. We had already set up another hidden camera near the entrance just in case. Now we waited. Hours passed, nothing happened. Then around midnight, a knock at the door, not loud, not hurried. Just a steady, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I froze. Ben, hidden in the other room, sent me a text. Ben, don't answer. But I was already moving toward the peephole, and there he was. Elliot Marshall, standing in the hallway, just standing, not knocking. Again. Not calling out, just waiting. I took a deep breath and spoke through the door. What do you want? A pause. Then, I just want to talk. His voice was quiet, calm, almost casual, like this was normal. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. I don't know you. Another pause. Then softly, yes, you do. A chill ran down my spine. Ben's voice came through my earpiece, a small Bluetooth connected to my phone. Keep him talking, he whispered. I exhaled. Why are you doing this? Elliot sighed. Because you don't remember. My fingers tightened around the doorknob. Remember what? Silence. Then, the night at the diner. My stomach twisted. I came in late, Elliot continued. It was almost closing time. You served me coffee. You smiled. You asked me how my night was. I blinked, my mind racing. I had done that 1,000 times for 1,000 different customers. Why did it matter to him? You were the first person to see me, Elliot murmured. Really see me. A sick realization washed over me. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't about revenge. This was obsession. A single, polite interaction had stuck in his mind, warped into something it wasn't. And when I hadn't noticed him after that, he had decided to make sure I did. My hands shook. Elliot, this has to stop. He sighed again. I know. Then, a click, a scraping sound near the doorknob. He was trying to unlock the door. Before I could react, Ben burst out of the bedroom. The door flew open and Elliot barely had time to flinch before Ben tackled him to the ground. I stumbled back as they struggled, my breath coming in short gasps. Ben was stronger, faster. Within seconds, he had Elliot pinned. Call the cops. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I dialed. Elliot didn't fight back. He just stared up at me, his face eerily calm. You could have understood, he said softly. I felt sick. The police arrived within minutes. Ben showed them the hidden camera footage, the messages, the threats, the break-in attempt. This time there was no maybe. No, we'll keep an eye on it. They arrested Elliot on the spot. I watched as they led him away, his hands cuffed behind, his back. He didn't struggle, didn't resist. But just before they put him in the squad car, he turned his head slightly and smiled. The days that followed were a blur of police reports, court proceedings, and endless explanations. Elliot was charged with harassment, breaking and entering, and unlawful surveillance. The evidence was overwhelming. He wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. But even knowing that, I didn't feel safe. Not yet. It took time. Time to change my locks. Time to sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat. Time to walk down the street without looking over my shoulder. Ben stayed close. So did my friends. And little by little, I took my life back. Months passed. Then one evening I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name written in careful, precise letters. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. No threats, no explanations, just 4 words written in small, neat handwriting. You finally saw me. I was 5 years old when I first encountered something that defied explanation. Something that still lingers in my memory like a dark cloud just waiting to pour. It happened in the small town of Waverly, a quiet place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Our house was an old single-story home that had been in my family for generations. My mother used to say it had character, but even as a child I sensed something else. A presence that felt too heavy, too aware. That night started like any other. My father worked late shifts, and my mother had already put me to bed before, settling into the living room to watch one of her favorite crime dramas. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, which I had long since learned to ignore. I remember waking up suddenly, my throat dry, my body stiff. A strange silence hung in the air, thicker than usual. I sat up in bed, listening. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound. At first it was faint, like the rustling of paper, but then it became louder, like wood dragging against the floor. My breath hitched as I recognized the noise. The dining room chairs. The sound repeated itself, deliberate and slow. Someone was moving them. I wanted to call out for my mom, but something held me back. A strange feeling settled in my gut, warning me to stay silent. Instead, I slid out of bed, my small feet padding against the cool wooden floor as I crept toward my bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of moonlight to stretch across the hall. From my position, I could see the entrance to the dining room. The shadows shifted, elongating unnaturally, and for a brief moment, I swore I saw movement. Something dark. Something just beyond the reach of the light. Then, clear as day, I heard my name. A woman's voice. Soft, almost melodic. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Eli. My breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't my mother's. It was unfamiliar, yet eerily intimate, as if whoever it belonged to knew me well. I backed away from the doorway, my small hands trembling as I reached for the doorknob to shut myself in. But before I could move, the chair closest to the hallway let out a long, agonizing scrape against the floor. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted, running down the hall as fast as my legs could carry me. I burst into my mother's room, throwing myself onto her bed and shaking her awake. "Mom," I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's in the dining room." She groaned, rubbing her eyes before glancing at the clock. "Eli, it's late. You had a bad dream, baby. Go back to sleep." "No," I insisted, my tiny hands clutching at her sleeve. I heard it. Someone moved the chairs and someone said my name. She sighed, sitting up. "It was probably the wind, honey. Or maybe the house settling." I shook my head violently. It wasn't the wind. Despite my insistence, she simply kissed my forehead and pulled the blankets over me. "Go to sleep, sweetheart. I promise. There's nothing to be afraid of." She turned off the light, and just like that, the conversation was over. But I knew what I had heard. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time I'd hear it. In the days following that night, I did my best to forget what happened. My mother's reassurance should have been enough to convince me that it was just a bad dream. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that dining room. At 5 years old, I didn't have the words to explain it, but I knew deep down that what I had heard, the scraping of the chairs, the voice calling my name, was real. And the worst part? I felt like whatever it was, it knew I had heard it. I tried to ignore it, I really did, but the house wouldn't let me. It started with the little things. At first, they were so subtle that I questioned if I was imagining them. A toy I had left in the middle of my bedroom floor would be on the windowsill when I woke up. My blanket, neatly tucked under my chin when I fell asleep, would be crumpled at the foot of my bed in the morning. I told myself that maybe I had moved them in my sleep. Maybe I just didn't remember. But then things started happening when I was wide awake. One afternoon, I was playing in the living room while my mother folded laundry. She hummed softly to herself, focused on her task, while I sat cross-legged on the floor, dragging my toy cars across the rug. That's when I heard the footsteps. Soft. At first, just a faint tap, 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 coming from the hallway. My back stiffened, and I turned toward the sound. Nothing was there. I looked at my mother, but she hadn't noticed anything. She just kept folding clothes, oblivious. I turned back to my cars, trying to shake it off, but then tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, closer. The hallway was empty, but I felt it, something watching, something waiting. Then a whisper. It was so faint I barely caught it, like a breath of wind curling around my ear. "Eli." My body went cold. I scrambled to my feet and ran straight to my mother, gripping the edge of her shirt with trembling fingers. "Mom." My voice was shaking. She glanced down, surprised by my sudden outburst. "What's wrong, baby?" I pointed toward the hallway. "I heard it again." She frowned, setting down the laundry. "Heard what?" "The voice," I whispered. "It said my name." She sighed, smoothing a hand over my hair. "Sweetheart, you've got to stop scaring yourself like this. There's nothing there." I turned back toward the hallway. It was still empty, silent. But I knew something had been there. And worse, I knew it wasn't going away. That night, I refused to sleep in my room. I begged my mother to let me stay in her bed, and after what felt like an eternity of pleading, she finally gave in. I curled up beside her, clutching my blanket tightly around me, listening to the steady sound of her breathing as she drifted off to sleep. I should have felt safe, but I didn't. At some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the walls. My mother was still asleep beside me, her back turned. Then I heard it, a faint scrape. 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 My breath hitched. It was coming from the dining room. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would stop, but it only grew louder. The slow, deliberate sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I wanted to wake my mother, to shake her awake and make her hear it, but I was frozen in place. And then, a single quiet knock. Not on the front door, not on the walls, but on the bedroom door. 3 slow knocks. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, the doorknob turned. The sound of the doorknob turning sent a jolt of pure terror through my tiny body. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was on the other side and wanted me to hear it. My breath caught in my throat as I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I didn't move, if I didn't breathe too loudly, it would just go away. It didn't. The knob rattled again, this time with more force. The faint click of the lock sliding free echoed in the dark room. The door was unlocked. I turned toward my mother, shaking her shoulder with small, frantic hands. "Mom," I whispered desperately, but she didn't stir. She was always a deep sleeper, but this was different. It was like she was too still, too quiet. I heard it then, the creak of the door slowly opening. A sliver of the dimly lit hallway appeared, the old wood groaning as the door inched wider. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs would crack. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. The air felt wrong, heavy, like something unseen had stepped into the room. I could feel it, hovering just inside the doorway, watching. The silence was unbearable. Then, ever so faintly, I heard it again. "Eli," a whisper, soft, almost gentle. But it wasn't my mother's voice. I choked back a sob, yanking the blanket over my head as if the thin fabric could protect me from whatever was in the room. I clung to my mother's back, my tiny fingers digging into the fabric of her nightgown, willing her to wake up. But she didn't. Minutes passed, agonizing, endless minutes where I lay there frozen, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the air shifted. The pressure in the room lifted, the weight of unseen eyes fading. And the door, slowly, quietly, closed. I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. My mother was already up, moving around the room, completely unaware of what had happened. I sat up, my body stiff, my hands still gripping the blankets. My mouth felt dry, my heart still hammering even though the room was now warm and bright. Had I imagined it? No. I knew I hadn't. I threw off the covers and ran to the bedroom door, hesitating before reaching for the knob. My fingers trembled. As I touched the cool metal, my stomach twisting. It was locked. From the inside. I knew I had heard it unlock in the middle of the night. I knew it had opened. But somehow, now, it was locked again. A chill ran down my spine. Something had been in this room last night. Something had unlocked that door. And now it wanted me to think it never happened. That morning, I refused to be alone. I stayed glued to my mother's side as she made breakfast, my eyes darting to the hallway every few seconds. The house felt different in the daylight, normal, safe, but I knew better now. As we sat at the table, I finally worked up the courage to speak. "Mom," I said quietly. She glanced at me while buttering a piece of toast. "Yeah, baby? Did you hear anything last night?" She frowned slightly. "Like what?" I swallowed. "Like someone knocking, or the door opening." She set the knife down, looking at me with tired but amused eyes. "Eli, you've really got to stop scaring yourself like this. You lock the door, baby. I had to unlock it this morning to get out of the room." My stomach dropped. "I didn't lock it," I whispered. She sighed. "Maybe you did in your sleep. You've been having a lot of bad dreams lately." But this wasn't a dream. I knew what I had heard. I stared down at my plate, my appetite gone. I didn't argue anymore because I knew she wouldn't believe me. No one would. I was completely alone in this. And deep down, I knew last night had only been the beginning. After that night, I stopped sleeping in my own bed. At first, my mother let me stay with her, convinced that I was just going through a phase. But after a few nights of me tossing and turning, waking her up with my constant fidgeting, she grew frustrated. "You have to sleep in your own room, Eli," she said firmly one evening as she tucked me into my bed. "Nothing is going to hurt you." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But deep down, I knew she was wrong. That night I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, tap, tap, tap. My heart stopped. It was coming from the hallway. I held my breath, my small fingers gripping the edge of my blanket so tightly they ached. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, like footsteps moving toward my room. The hallway light was on, casting a soft glow through the crack under my door. I could see a shadow moving, dark and slow, passing back and forth. Someone, or something, was outside my room. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to scream for my mother, but I was too afraid. I didn't want it to know I was awake. Then, just as I started to convince myself I was imagining it, the door handle twisted. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. The handle rattled once, then twice before going still, then ever so softly. "Eli." A whisper. Close. Too close. My entire body locked up. It sounded like a woman's voice, but not my mother's. It was almost familiar, yet so completely wrong. I squeezed my eyes shut, trembling under the blankets. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, too scared to move. Eventually, the shadow disappeared. The tapping stopped. But I didn't sleep. Not that night. Not for many nights after. The next morning, I felt like a zombie. My mother barely looked at me as she rushed around the house, getting ready for work. "You need to start sleeping, Eli," she said over her shoulder as she sipped her coffee. "You look exhausted." I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to tell her that something had tried to come into my room last night, that I had seen it pacing outside my door, that I had heard it whispers my name, but I knew she wouldn't believe me. So I just nodded and poked at my cereal, my stomach too twisted to eat. That afternoon, I decided to test something. I waited until my mother was in the backyard, hanging up laundry, before I crept down the hallway and stood in front of my bedroom door. My hands trembled as I reached for the knob. I turned it. Locked. My breath hitched. I never locked my door during the day. I forced myself to twist the knob harder, pushing the door open. The room was exactly how I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt different, wrong, like something had been in there. I swallowed hard and took a step inside, scanning the room. My bed was still unmade from the morning. My toys were scattered on the floor. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. I frowned. Hadn't I closed it before bed? I took another step, closer, my heart pounding. Something creaked. I froze. It came from inside the closet. I wanted to run. I should have run, but instead, I reached out with a shaking hand and grabbed the closet door, slowly pulling it open. Nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly, my shoes lined up at the bottom. I let out a shaky breath, feeling both relieved and stupid. I had scared myself over nothing. Then, just as I started to turn away, a single breath, soft, barely there, behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The air was still, too still. And then, I saw it. Not fully, just a flicker. A shadow, tall, thin. Wrong. Darting out of sight into the hallway. My stomach dropped. It had been watching me. I bolted out of the room, nearly tripping over my own feet as I ran straight to the backyard. My mother looked up, startled. "Eli, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer. My chest was heaving, my skin cold with fear. I knew now I wasn't just hearing things, I wasn't just imagining it. Something was in this house, and it was getting closer. People love to tell ghost stories, but most don't believe in them. I didn't either, at least not at first. I grew up in a quiet town in eastern Germany, in a house that had been in my family for generations. It was old, with thick wooden beams and windows that rattled in the wind. My mother called it charming. My father swore it was built to last. But to me, it always felt like something was watching. Not in the way kids imagine monsters under the bed, but in a way that stayed with me even when I wasn't afraid. It was like the house held its breath, waiting. The first time I knew something was wrong, I was 6 years old. It was late autumn, the nights growing colder, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and burning wood. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me in the care of my older brother Lucas. He was 14, too old to care about babysitting, so he left me alone in the living room while he played video games in his room. I didn't mind. I liked being alone. Or at least I thought I did. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I was lying on the couch, half watching cartoons, half dozing, when I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was Lucas talking to himself, but as I listened, the whispering continued, soft, almost urgent, and it was coming from the hallway. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The TV flickered in the dim room, casting shadows against the walls. "Lucas?" I called. No answer. The whispering didn't stop. It was faint, just out of reach, like someone was standing just beyond the doorway, speaking in hushed tones. I swallowed hard. The hallway was dark, stretching toward the staircase like a tunnel. My breath felt too loud in my own ears. I slid off the couch and took a hesitant step forward. The whispering stopped. I froze, my fingers curling into the fabric of my pajama pants. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, a single word. Emil. My name, spoken by a voice I had never heard before. I turned and ran. I sprinted up the stairs, my heart slamming against my ribs, and threw myself into Lucas's room. He barely glanced up from his game. "Why are you freaking out?" he asked, annoyed. I gasped for breath, my entire body shaking. Someone said my name." Lucas sighed, pausing his game. "It was probably the TV." I shook my head violently. "No, it was real." He rolled his eyes. "You're just imagining things." But I wasn't. I knew what I heard. That night, I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, staring at the hallway through the crack in my door. I didn't sleep, because deep down, I knew. Whatever had whispered my name wasn't imaginary, and it wasn't going away. I never told my parents about the whisper in the hallway, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew they wouldn't believe me. Lucas had already dismissed it, and if I tried to tell my mother, she would say I had a bad dream. My father would just laugh and tell me to stop watching scary movies, so I kept it to myself. But that didn't mean I stopped thinking about it. In the weeks that followed, I found myself listening, waiting, hoping in some way that I had imagined it. But part of me knew better. Something had spoken to me that night, something that shouldn't have been there. I started reading about ghosts, devouring every book I could find in the small-town library. Most of them were filled with the same tired stories, white figures floating down hallways, doors slamming shut on their own, cold spots in empty rooms. But the ones that stuck with me were the stories that felt sad. Not all ghosts were violent. Some were just lost spirits that couldn't move on, that couldn't move, trapped between this world and the next, waiting for something. I didn't know what they were waiting for, but I started to wonder, what if the ghost in my house wasn't trying to scare me? What if it just wanted to be heard? That thought stayed with me. It made the fear more bearable, until the night I saw it. It was late, maybe past midnight. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams as the wind pressed against the walls. I had been asleep, but something woke me, a feeling like the air had changed. I blinked in the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the street lamp outside. My bedroom door was slightly open, just like I had left it. The hallway beyond was black, a tunnel stretching into nothing. I sat up slowly, my heart beating, too fast. Then in the silence, a soft sound. Not a whisper this time. A breath. Long and slow, like someone exhaling just outside my room. I stared at the doorway, my entire body stiff with fear. And then it moved. A shadow. Not like the ones cast by the trees outside. This shadow had weight. A shape. A presence. Standing in the hallway. Watching me. I couldn't see its face. I didn't want to see its face. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. Then so softly it barely made a sound. It took a step forward. The floor didn't creak. The air didn't stir. But I felt it. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, as if sensing my terror, it stopped. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it. Waiting for me to see it. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the lamp beside my bed. My fingers fumbled for the switch. As soon as the light flicked on, the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty, but the air still felt wrong, like something had been there just a moment before. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the open doorway, waiting for it to return. It never did. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was still in the house, still waiting. The days after I saw the shadow felt different. The house hadn't changed, but I had. It was like knowing for sure that something was there had shifted everything. I walked through the halls more carefully, always aware of the corners where the light didn't quite reach. Lucas still didn't believe me. When I finally told him what I saw, he just snorted. "You probably dreamed it," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "I was awake," I insisted. "Then it was your imagination." He grinned, nudging me. "Come on, Emile. If ghosts were real, wouldn't they have done something by now? Why would they just stand there?" I didn't have an answer, but I did have a feeling. And it only got stronger the night the storm came. It started just after sunset, creeping in slowly, dark clouds rolling over the sky, the air turning thick and heavy. By the time we finished dinner, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Our parents were supposed to be home by now. They had gone into town earlier for groceries, but the storm had slowed everything down. My mother had called once to say they were waiting for the rain to let up before driving back. That meant we were alone. Lucas didn't care. He sprawled on the couch, headphones on, lost in some game on his phone. I sat near the window, watching the trees sway wildly outside, my stomach tight. Something about the storm felt wrong. Not just the way the wind howled, or the way the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. It was something else. A tension in the air. Like the house was holding its breath. Kasia, my younger sister, was already in her room. She hated storms. Whenever one hit, she'd bury herself under blankets and refuse to come out. I envied her. I wished I could hide, too. The lights flickered, once, twice, then everything went dark. Kasia screamed from down the hall. I jumped up, my heart hammering. Lucas groaned. "Seriously?" He yanked off his headphones. "You guys are such babies." I ignored him and grabbed the flashlight from the drawer near the TV. I clicked it, on the weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. Another gust of wind slammed against the house. Then beneath it, something else. A sound. Not the storm. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Lucas and I both froze. The wind howled outside, rain pounding against the roof, but the knocking came again. Steady, too controlled to be the storm. Kazia's voice trembled from the hallway. "Who's at the door?" I didn't answer. Lucas stood up, frowning. "Maybe it's Mom and Dad," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. I swallowed hard. They would have called first. He hesitated, then grabbed his phone, clicking on the screen. The battery was dead. "Great," he muttered. He turned to me. "Go open it." I stiffened. No way. Another knock. This time, slower. I shone the flashlight toward the front door. The hallway stretched ahead. Too dark. Too quiet. My chest tightened. Lucas sighed and rolled his eyes. "Fine, I'll do it." He marched toward the door, his footsteps too loud in the silence. I followed, staying just behind him. The air felt thick, heavy. Lucas reached for the lock, but before he could turn it, the door pushed inward. Not a gust of wind, not someone knocking harder. It just opened by itself. The darkness outside yawned before us, rain spilling onto the doorstep. There was no one there. Lucas took a shaky step back. He cleared his throat. "That's weird." My stomach twisted. I lifted the flashlight, shining it outside. The rain came down in thick sheets, the trees bending under the wind. But the driveway, it was empty. No car, no headlights in the distance, just the storm, and something else. In the wet grass beyond the porch, footprints, fresh ones, leading up to the door, but none going back. I grabbed Lucas's arm. "Shut it." For once, he didn't argue. He slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. The air inside felt suffocating now, the storm raging outside, but the real fear wasn't out there. It was here, because something had come to our door, and it didn't need to be knocked twice. The house felt different after the door opened on its own. Not just the way it should have felt, like a draft had blown it open, like it had been a trick of the wind. No, it felt wrong in a way that sat deep in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, making my skin crawl. Lucas didn't speak as he turned the lock, his hand lingering on the cold metal for a second too long. I could tell he was trying to act normal, trying to convince himself that what had just happened wasn't what it was. But I had seen his face. He was scared. Kazia stood in the hallway, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest. The flickering glow of my flashlight made her face look pale, her eyes wide. "Who was it?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. Lucas cleared his throat. "Just the wind." Even he didn't believe it. I turned the flashlight toward the floor. The footprints were still there, just outside the door, dark impressions in the wet grass. My stomach tightened. No footprints leading away. Something had walked up to our door, but it hadn't walked away. I swallowed hard. "We should check the rest of the house." Lucas shot me a sharp look. "For what?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I just had a feeling, an awful, gnawing sense that closing the door hadn't ended anything, that whatever had come to us was still here. Lucas sighed. "Fine, but when we don't find anything, you owe me an apology for freaking out over nothing." I didn't bother pointing out that he was just as freaked out. We moved slowly, checking every room. Lucas led the way, his shoulders stiff, while I followed with the flashlight. The power was still out, and the dim glow barely reached past the edges of the hallway. The kitchen was empty, the living room too, but the air still felt thick. Too thick. Kasia stayed close to me, holding my hand tightly. We reached the stairs. I didn't want to go up. Lucas hesitated, his fingers tightening into a fist before he stepped onto the first step. It creaked under his weight. Then, another creak, but this time, Not from Lucas. From above us. We all froze. The sound had come from the upstairs hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the top of the stairs. Lucas turned to me, his face pale in the glow of the flashlight. His voice was barely a whisper. "That wasn't you, right?" I shook my head. We stood there listening. Another step. Then another. Slow, heavy, coming closer. Kasia whimpered, her grip on my hand so tight it hurt. I aimed the flashlight toward the top of the stairs. The beam wavered, bouncing off the wooden floor, the door frames, the ceiling, and then, for the briefest moment, it caught something. A figure, standing at the top of the stairs, not clearly, not enough to see its face, just a shape, tall, still, watching. Then the light flickered, and it was gone, not like it had moved, like it had never been there at all. I grabbed Lucas's sleeve. "We need to get out of here." He didn't argue this time. We turned and ran. We ran. Not up the stairs. Not toward whatever was standing at the top, waiting for us. We ran the other way, back down the hall, past the kitchen, toward the back door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. Lucas shoved past me, yanking at the handle. It didn't budge. His face twisted in frustration. "Come on, come on!" I tried not to panic. Maybe the storm had swollen the wood. Maybe the old latch had jammed, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. The house didn't want us to leave. A slow creak came from behind us. Kasia let out a tiny whimper, pressing herself against my side. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Something standing at the entrance to the hallway just out of sight. Watching. Lucas abandoned the door and grabbed my arm. "Front door," he gasped. We sprinted through the dark, my flashlight flickering wildly as we ran. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. We reached the front door. Lucas fumbled with the lock. I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing, it wouldn't move, just like the back door. Just like the house itself was holding us inside. The temperature dropped. The air felt too thick, pressing in around us like the walls were breathing. Then, a whisper. Not from the stairs, not from the hallway, from right next to me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. For the first time, I saw it. A figure. Not a shadow this time. Not a glimpse from the corner of my eye. A woman. She stood, barely a foot away from me, her face pale, her eyes dark. Her mouth was slightly open like she was trying to speak. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach drop, made my entire body go cold, was the way she looked at me. Like she knew me. Like she had been waiting for me. Lucas let out a sharp breath. "Holy..." He grabbed me, yanking me backward so hard I almost fell. The lights flickered once. Then the power came back. The house flooded with warm, golden light. The moment it did, she was gone. No slow fade. No lingering presence. Just gone. Kasia burst into tears. Lucas looked at me, his face pale. "You saw that," he said, his voice raw. "You saw that." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The front door was unlocked now. The back door too, like nothing had ever happened. We didn't waste time. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached the street. The storm had finally died down, leaving only wet pavement and cold air in its wake. The house stood behind us, dark and quiet. Normal. But we knew better. When our parents came home an hour later, we didn't tell them everything. They wouldn't have believed us. And even if they did, it wouldn't have changed what we knew. The house had been waiting. For me. For us. And that night it finally let us see it. But I don't think it wanted to hurt us. Not really. It had just been waiting for someone to listen. I was 13 the first time I saw Jerry. At least that's what I started calling him after I realized he wasn't going anywhere. It happened during a cold November evening in Prague. The streets were quiet, slick with rain, and the sky had turned the color of bruised metal. I was walking home from a friend's house, taking the usual route through the old part of town. The buildings here were older, their facades cracked and weathered by time, and the cobblestone streets always seemed to echo just a little too much when you walked alone. That night, I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the usual sounds of the city settling in for the night. But as I turned onto a narrow street lined with shuttered cafes and dimly lit street lamps, I heard it. Footsteps, not my own. They came from behind me, perfectly in sync with mine. I stopped. They stopped. A chill ran down my spine. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone there. Maybe another late-night walker, a tourist lost in the maze of streets. But there was no one. The street was empty. I swallowed hard and shook it off. Maybe I was imagining things. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. I kept walking. The footsteps followed. This time, I didn't stop. I walked faster, my breath coming quicker. The footsteps matched my pace exactly. I turned another corner, this time onto my own street. The old apartment building where I lived with my parents was just ahead, its windows dark. I reached into my pocket for my keys, my fingers trembling slightly. And then, just as I reached the front steps, a voice, soft, distant but unmistakable. Mate, my name, whispered from the shadows. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. That's when I saw him, a boy, standing beneath the dim glow of a street lamp. He looked my age, maybe a little older. His clothes were old-fashioned, something out of another time. His face was pale, his eyes dark and lifeless, as if all the color had been drained from them. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me. My breath hitched. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The street was silent. The air felt heavy, thick with something I didn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. One blink, and the space where he stood was empty. I stood frozen for what felt like forever before I finally forced myself up the stairs into the apartment and locked the door behind me. That night I barely slept, because deep down I knew. Jerry, whoever he was, wasn't just passing through. He had been waiting for me. Years passed, but Jerry never left. At first I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that the cold night, the flickering streetlights, and my own paranoia had created something that wasn't really there. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps never stopped. They didn't happen every night, but often enough that I started recognizing the pattern. I would be walking home alone, usually late, and somewhere along the way the rhythm of my own steps would double. Always perfectly in sync, always just a second too late to be an echo. I never told anyone. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. Lucas, my best friend, would have laughed. My parents would have brushed it off as an overactive imagination, so I learned to live with it. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late autumn again, just like the first time. The air was sharp with the scent of burning wood from chimneys, and the streets were damp from an earlier rain. I was walking, home from a cafe, the same way I always did, taking the quiet back streets that wound through the older part of town. The moment I turned onto a narrow alleyway between two crumbling buildings, I felt it. The air shifted. Not colder, exactly, but heavier. I knew what was coming before I even heard the first step. The footsteps started slow, keeping pace with me as I walked. I forced myself not to stop, not to look. My hands curled into fists inside my jacket pockets, my breath steady but shallow. Then, something new. A whisper. Not my name this time, just a sound, like breath against stone. I swallowed hard. My apartment was still 2 streets away. If I ran, I'd have to go through the dark, winding alleys, and I didn't know what was worse, staying on the empty, open street or disappearing into the shadows. Then, up ahead, movement. At first, I thought it was just another pedestrian, some stranger heading home for the night. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. It was him, Jerry, standing beneath a dim, flickering street lamp just like before. His face was the same, pale, expressionless, his eyes empty, too dark for the weak glow of the lamp to reflect in them. Only this time he wasn't alone. 2 others stood behind him, barely visible in the shadows. I stopped. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed. I could hear my own breathing, fast and uneven. The street was silent, but I could feel them watching. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the wet pavement as I sprinted down the street, my breath sharp in the cold night air. I didn't think. I didn't look back. Every instinct in me screamed to run. But no matter how fast I moved, I could still feel them, the weight of their gaze, the unnatural silence pressing in around me. I turned sharply onto another street, my boots slipping slightly on the damp cobblestones. The buildings loomed above me, dark and quiet, their windows like empty eyes watching me pass. My apartment wasn't far, just a few more turns. Then I heard it, not footsteps this time, not whispers, breathing, shallow, raspy, close, too close. I gasped and spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. No one. The street behind me was empty, but I wasn't alone. The air around me was thick, heavy in a way that made my skin crawl. My eyes darted to the alleyway just ahead, its mouth yawning open like a black void between the buildings. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement. A flicker of something, pale. A figure stepping out from behind a corner. Jerry. Standing there, still and silent, just a few feet away. But something was different this time. His head was tilted slightly, like he was studying me. His lips parted, just enough for a sharp breath to escape. His hands, thin and almost colorless, hung at his sides, fingers twitching like he was trying to move them. The shadows shifted behind him. The others were still there, watching, waiting. I took a shaky step backward. "Leave me alone," I whispered. Jerry didn't blink. He didn't move. But I felt something shift, like he had heard me, like he understood. Then, slowly, too smoothly for any living person, he took a step forward. I bolted. I ran harder than I ever had before, tearing through the empty streets, my lungs burning. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. Street after street blurred past me until I finally turned onto my own block. Relief crashed over me as I spotted my apartment building ahead. I fumbled for my keys, nearly dropping them as I reached the front door. My fingers were stiff from the cold, or maybe from fear, but I forced them to cooperate, shoving the key into the lock and twisting hard. The door swung open. I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. Silence. I pressed my back against the door, my chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. Outside, the street was empty. No Jerry. No figures in the shadows. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Because the moment I stepped into my apartment, the air around me felt different, like something had followed me inside. The door clicked shut behind me, but the apartment didn't feel safe. The silence inside was too thick, too expectant, like the walls were listening. The air smelled different, faintly damp, like old stone. My breath was still uneven, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself I was overreacting. I had outrun them. I was inside now, in my own home. The dead couldn't follow me in here. Could they? I forced my feet to move, crossing the narrow hallway toward the small kitchen. The overhead light flickered when I switched it on, the old bulb struggling against the sudden brightness. I braced myself against the counter, pressing my palms to the cold surface, trying to steady my hands. Everything felt normal. The table was where I left it. My jacket still hung over the back of a chair. The sink dripped like it always did. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe Jerry and the others had never been there at all. Then behind me, a creak. I froze. The floorboard in the hallway, the one that only groaned when someone stepped on it. I turned my head slowly, barely breathing. The hallway stretched behind me, the door still locked, the lights from outside, casting weak, shifting patterns through the window, empty. I exhaled, a nervous laugh catching in my throat. The old floors creaked all the time. It didn't mean anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped back into the hallway, moving toward my bedroom. My body was still tense, my ears tuned to every small sound. My door was open just a crack. Had I left it that way? I didn't remember. Swallowing hard, I reached out and pushed it open. The room was dim, the only light coming from the glow of the street lamp outside. My bed was unmade, the blanket half on the floor. My desk was cluttered, the same as always. Nothing was out of place. And yet, the air felt different. I took another cautious step inside, my skin prickling. I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, but before my fingers could touch the switch, a breath, soft, close, right behind me. I spun around, my pulse slamming against my ribs. No one, nothing. The hallway was still empty. The apartment was still silent. But my body knew what my eyes refused to see. I wasn't alone. I turned back toward my bed, my legs shaking, my entire body screaming at me to leave. But before I could move, I saw it, the mirror. It stood in the corner of my room, angled slightly toward the bed. And in the dim light, just for a second, I saw something reflected that wasn't there. A figure, standing in the hallway watching me. I didn't turn around, I couldn't, because deep down I knew if I turned to face it, it wouldn't disappear. It would still be there. And this time, it wouldn't let me run. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes stayed locked on the mirror on the figure standing in the hallway behind me. The reflection was hazy, the light from the street lamp too dim to show details. But I didn't need details. I knew it was Jerry, and I knew he wasn't alone. Shapes lingered behind him, shifting in the darkness. Silent, waiting. The air in my room felt thick, pressing against my skin like a heavy fog. The steady drip of the kitchen sink echoed through the apartment, too loud in the silence. I needed to move, but every muscle in my body refused. The reflection shifted. Jerry took a step forward, a small, slow step. Not a threat, not an attack, something else. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to work. It came out in a whisper. "What do you want?" The room held its breath. Jerry's head tilted slightly, his dark, lifeless eyes locked onto mine in the glass. For the first time, I realized how tired he looked, like someone who had been walking for too long, searching for something he couldn't find. I gripped the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking. "Why are you following me?" Another step. My skin prickled, but I didn't run. I was done running. The others behind him didn't move. They didn't need to. They weren't here for me. But Jerry was. The realization hit me like a wave of cold water. He wasn't haunting me. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was waiting for me to understand, for me to see him. I took a slow, shaky breath. "I see you," I whispered. Jerry stopped. The air in the room shifted. Not warmer, not safer, but different, lighter somehow. The silence stretched. Then, so soft, I almost didn't hear it. A whisper, not in my head, not from the mirror. Right behind me, thank you. A breath of wind brushed against my neck. The light flickered, and just like that, he was gone. I turned around slowly, my heart still pounding. The hallway was empty. The mirror reflected only my own face, pale and wide-eyed, the dim glow of the street lamp behind me. I let out a shaky breath, my body finally relaxing. I didn't know where he had gone. I didn't know if he would come back. But somehow, I knew this was over. Jerry had been waiting for someone to see him, to acknowledge him, and now, maybe, he could finally rest. I stepped away from the mirror, my legs still weak, and sat on the edge of my bed. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but it no longer felt like a whisper calling my name. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the footsteps behind me, because I knew now, not all ghosts are here to haunt us. Some are just waiting to be seen. I was 11 the first time I heard my Aunt Clara talk about the boy. She never spoke about him during the day, never when the sun was shining or when there were too many people in the house. But late at night, when I stayed over at her home, in the Czech countryside, she would sit in her old chair by the fireplace watching the flames flicker and tell me things she had never told anyone else. This story, she said, was not meant to frighten me, but even then I knew better. She had been much younger when it happened, barely in her 20s, working as a nurse in a small town where everyone knew each other's secrets. That's where she met the boy, Mate. He was quiet, small for his age, with dark, serious eyes that made him look older than 6. His father had brought him into the hospital one evening, claiming the boy had been sick for days, barely eating, barely speaking. His mother had been gone for weeks by then, vanished without a trace, and the entire town whispered about what had really happened to her. Some said she had run away with another man. Others said she had drowned herself in the river, unable to bear the life she had married into. But the quietest voices, the ones spoken only in hushed tones, said something else entirely, that she hadn't left at all, that she was still there, watching, waiting. Clara didn't believe in ghost stories, not back then. She believed in medicine, in logic, in the simple truth that people either lived or they died. But the boy didn't act like any other sick child she had cared for. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He was afraid of something in the dark. "She's coming," he told her one night, his voice barely a whisper. Clara frowned, brushing his damp hair back from his forehead. "Who is?" He turned his head slowly, his gaze locked onto the corner of the room. "My mother." Clara felt a chill creep up her spine. She had been in the house the night they brought Mate in. She had seen the father's face, tight with something that looked too much like fear. And she had seen the way the boy never cried for the mother who had disappeared, like he knew she hadn't really left. Clara swallowed. "Mate, your mother, she's waiting," he interrupted. His voice was flat, emotionless. And then slowly he smiled. "She wants to take me with her." Clara didn't sleep that night. The next morning she told the other nurses what Mate had said. They all gave her the same look, half pity, half amusement. "He's grieving," one of them said. "Children don't understand death the way we do." But Clara wasn't sure if that was true, because when she looked at Mate, she didn't see a grieving child. She saw a boy waiting for something, or someone. Aunt Clara told me that after Mate's strange words, she did her best to push the fear aside. He was just a child, after all. Children said unsettling things all the time, things they didn't fully understand. But deep down, something about it felt different. She tried to convince herself that the boy was just confused, that he missed his mother and was clinging to a fantasy where she would return. But there was something in the way he said it, something in the way he smiled that night, that made her uneasy. And then the whispers started. The first time she heard it, she thought it was the wind. The old hospital was full of drafts, and on stormy nights the wooden beams creaked and groaned as if the building itself was alive. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably human. She had been working late, finishing paperwork at the nurses' station, just down the hall from Mate's room. The other staff had gone home, leaving her alone for the night shift. The only sounds were the scratch of her pen, the ticking of the clock, and the occasional drip of a leaky pipe. Then, just beyond the open doorway, she heard it. A whisper, low and hushed like someone speaking just out of reach. She froze, her pen hovering over the paper. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Mate?" she called out, her voice careful. No answer. She stood up, forcing her feet to move as she stepped into the hallway. The dim light from the wall lamps cast long shadows, stretching the empty corridor into something endless. The whisper came, again but softer this time. She followed it. Mate's door was slightly ajar. Through the crack she could see him lying in bed, perfectly still. His chest rose and fell in slow, even breaths. But he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. She pushed the door open further, her pulse racing. "Mate." Slowly his head turned toward her. "She's here," he murmured. A cold wave of fear rolled over her. "Who's here?" she whispered. His gaze shifted past her toward the doorway. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn, to look over her shoulder, but some deep, primal instinct kept her rooted in place. "She's watching," Mate whispered. The room felt suddenly colder. Clara forced herself to move, stepping closer to his bed, trying to shake off the unease curling around her spine. "Mate, you need to sleep," she said, keeping her voice calm. "No one is here." He didn't argue, but as she pulled the blanket up to his chin, she heard it again, not from the hallway, not from inside the room, from right beside her. A whisper, soft, close. "Mine." Clara's body went rigid. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The room was empty. The shadows in the corners stretched, unnaturally, the dim light warping their shapes. But there was nothing there. Nothing she could see. She turned back to Mate, her hands ice cold. He was still staring at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. "She's waiting," he said. And then, slowly, he closed his eyes. Clara didn't sleep that night, because deep down she knew Mate's mother hadn't left. She was still here, and she wanted her son back. Aunt Clara didn't go home the next morning. She should have. Her shift had ended hours before, and the next nurse had already taken over. But she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not after what she had heard. Not after the whisper that had come from nowhere, or from something she couldn't see. So instead, she stayed. She busied herself with paperwork, checked on other patients, anything to keep her mind occupied, but the feeling never left. That awareness, like unseen eyes, were watching her, following her through the dimly lit halls. By mid-afternoon, the tension in her chest had eased just enough for her to convince herself she had imagined it. The exhaustion, the stress, the eerie quiet of the hospital at night, it had all played tricks on her mind. That was the only logical explanation. And then, just as she was about to leave, Mate's father arrived. She hadn't seen him since the night he had brought his son in. He was a broad-shouldered man with a rough face, the kind that never looked completely at ease. There was something about him that had unsettled her from the moment they met. Something in his dark, tired eyes that hinted at a deeper kind of trouble. He walked straight past the front desk, barely acknowledging the receptionist. Clara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. He wasn't here to visit. He was here for answers. She stepped forward before he could reach Mate's room. "Sir," she said carefully, "is everything all right?" His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and unreadable. "I need to see my son." There was something in his tone that made her uneasy. "Mate is resting. He had a long night." His jaw tightened. "He told me something." Clara hesitated. "What did he say?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze flickered past her, toward the hallway leading to Mate's room. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost uncertain. He said she's coming back. A cold weight settled in Clara's stomach. She studied his face, searching for any sign that he was mocking the idea that he thought his son was just a confused little boy. But he wasn't laughing. He was afraid. Clara swallowed. "Who do you think he means?" His eyes darkened. "His mother." Silence stretched between them. Then he stepped past her, his movements stiff, determined. She wanted to stop him, to tell him that his son needed rest, that maybe he was only making things worse by feeding into the boy's fears. But before she could say a word, the lights flickered. Just once. Barely a second. But the air around them changed. The hallway suddenly felt colder. The usual hum of distant voices, the quiet beeping of heart monitors, it all seemed distant, muffled, like the entire building was listening. Then, at the far end of the corridor, something moved. Clara's breath hitched. A shadow. Tall. Still. Standing just at the edge of the dim light, barely visible. She couldn't see details, couldn't make out a face, but the shape was unmistakable. A woman. Her entire body went rigid. Matej's father saw it too. His face paled, his breath unsteady. "No," he whispered. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came, because in that moment, the shadow shifted and started walking toward them. Clara couldn't move. The shadow at the end of the hallway didn't walk like a person. It didn't sway with the natural rhythm of steps, didn't make a sound as it moved. It simply glided forward, growing darker as it approached, the air around it seeming to fold inward. Matej's father let out a sharp breath. Then, without a word, he turned and ran. Clara's body finally obeyed, her legs stumbling as she rushed after him. The corridor stretched too long, the walls pressing in, the air growing colder with each step. She barely registered the flickering lights. The way the sound of their footsteps seemed too quiet, swallowed by something deeper. Matej's room was just ahead. His father reached the door first, shoving it open so hard it slammed against the wall. Matej was sitting up in bed, awake, waiting. "She's here," he murmured. His father grabbed his arm. "We're leaving." Matej didn't resist, didn't question it. He only slid off the bed, his bare feet pressing against the cold floor. Clara reached for the door to close it behind them. It wouldn't move. Her breath caught. She tried again, gripping the handle with both hands, pulling. But it was like something was pressing back against it, holding it open. The shadow was close now. The air inside the room grew thick, the overhead light buzzing. Clara felt her own heartbeat in her throat, fast and uneven. She turned back to Matej, expecting him to be afraid, to cling to his father the way any child would. But he was staring at the open door, at her. The light above them flickered violently, the entire room plunging in and out of darkness. Clara saw her then, just for a second. A glimpse of something wrong. A woman, her face blurred like smeared ink, her mouth parted slightly as if whispering something too soft to hear. But it wasn't her face that sent ice through Clara's veins. It was her hands, thin, colorless fingers reaching for Matej. Clara moved without thinking, grabbing the boy and pulling him back. The door slammed shut. The air in the room collapsed like something had been sucked out of it. The light steadied. The pressure lifted. Clara stumbled backward, still holding Matej against her chest. His small frame trembled. His father stood, frozen, his face pale, his eyes locked on the door as if expecting it to burst open. It didn't. The hospital was silent again, but Clara knew it wasn't over. She knew what had happened. The boy's mother hadn't come for his father. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come for her son, and she wasn't going to stop. For the rest of the night, Clara stayed in Matej's hospital room. She didn't leave, didn't sleep, didn't even turn off the lights. Neither did his father. He sat stiffly in the chair by the bed, hands gripping the arms so tightly his knuckles turned white. Matej lay between them, his small body curled beneath the blanket, silent. He hadn't spoken a word since the door slammed shut, but Clara knew he was awake. The way his breathing changed whenever the floor creaked, the way his fingers twitched when the wind howled outside. He was listening, waiting. Clara wanted to tell him he was safe now, that his mother, whatever she had become, was gone. But she couldn't bring herself to say it, because she wasn't sure if it was true. Morning came slowly. The hospital came back to life. Nurses passing in the halls, carts rolling by, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. The world outside had moved on, but something in that room had changed. Clara felt it before she even opened her eyes. The stillness, the weight pressing against her chest, the same way it had the night before, the way the air felt too quiet for a place filled with life. Then she heard it, a sigh, soft, gentle, like a mother sitting beside her child. She sat up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Matej wasn't in bed. Her heart nearly stopped. She turned wildly, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. And then she saw him, standing by the window. His small hands rested on the glass, his dark eyes fixed on something outside. Clara followed his gaze, her stomach twisting. The parking lot was empty except for a few nurses heading inside. The early morning sky still streaked with pink, nothing else. Nothing she could see. She swallowed hard. Matej? He didn't turn, but he spoke. She's not waiting anymore, he murmured. Clara's breath caught. Matej pressed his fingers against the glass. His reflection wavered, slightly his expression unreadable. She was sad, he whispered. She just wanted me to come home. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that this was home, that he belonged here in the warmth of the hospital room, in the world of the living. But before she could, he turned and smiled. It was the softest smile she had ever seen, on his face. No fear, no sadness, just a quiet understanding. Then, without another word, he climbed back into bed and closed his eyes. Clara watched him for a long time, waiting for him to open them again. He didn't. When the doctor came in later that morning, he pronounced Matej's death as sudden heart failure. No explanation, no warning, just gone. His father didn't cry. He just stood there staring at his son's still face, his hands curled into tight fists. He didn't look at Clara, but as he walked out of the room, he whispered something so low she almost didn't hear it. She took him. Clara wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it had just been an illness, something medical, something that could be explained. But deep down, she knew the truth. Matej's mother had never left. She had waited, and in the end, she had come back for her son. That night, when Clara went home, she sat by the fireplace and stared into the flames, replaying every moment, in her mind. She wanted to tell herself that ghosts weren't real, that what she had seen, what she had felt, had all been exhaustion, fear, grief. But she knew better. Some spirits don't haunt out of anger. Some don't stay because they were wronged. Some just can't let go. And sometimes, no matter how much the living try to hold on, the dead take what is theirs. I still remember the sound of the dirt bike engine echoing through the woods, the rhythmic hum bouncing off the trees as I followed my stepdad through the narrow trails. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, the cool breeze, against my face the only relief from the burning midday sun. Dirt biking was something we did often. My stepdad, Mark, had been riding for years, and he took pride in teaching me everything he knew. Balance, throttle control, the way to lean just enough into a turn without losing control. It had become second nature to me. That day we had decided to ride farther than usual, past the familiar trails near our house and into an older, less used part of the forest. The dirt path was uneven, scattered with deep grooves and tangled roots, but the thrill of it pushed me forward. Everything was fine until I smelled it, a sharp, acrid scent cutting through the air, distinct even over the gasoline and fresh dirt. Burning. At first I thought it was just the bike overheating. We had been riding for hours after all. But as I slowed down, letting the engine idle beneath me, the scent grew stronger. Mark pulled up beside me, dust swirling in the air as he cut the engine. Everything okay? I nodded, but the smell was making my stomach turn. It wasn't just burning rubber or overheated metal. It was something worse. I climbed off the bike, my hands shaking slightly as I bent down to check the engine. That's when I saw it. Tangled in the metal, caught near the chain, was something, dark and singed. Hair. I recoiled instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. It was unmistakable. Long strands, burned at the ends, sticking to the hot metal like they had been melted there. Mark crouched beside me, frowning as he reached out and tugged at the strands. They came loose in his fingers, brittle and blackened. He turned them over in his palm before shaking his head. Probably just an animal, he said. Squirrel or something got too close to the trail. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I stood there, staring at the bike, a deep, unsettling feeling crept into my chest. It didn't look like animal fur. It looked like human hair. I forced myself to brush it off, to shake away the thought. We were in the middle of nowhere. It had to be from some animal, maybe caught in the chain as we rode through the underbrush. Still, as we kicked the bikes back to life and headed home, I couldn't help but feel like something unseen was following us, watching, waiting. By the time we got home, the uneasy feeling still hadn't left me. Mark, of course, had already moved on. He leaned his bike against the garage wall and wiped the sweat from his forehead, already talking about dinner like we hadn't just found something wrong tangled in the engine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. But as I walked into the house, something about the air felt different, heavier. I kicked off my boots and headed straight for the bathroom. The ride had left my clothes covered in dust, my arms and legs streaked with dirt. All I wanted was to scrub the day off, let the hot water wash away the lingering unease. The pipes groaned as I turned on the shower, the old plumbing taking its time warming up. I pulled off my shirt, tossing it onto the floor before stepping into the tub. The water was too hot at first, scalding against my skin, but I didn't care. I let my eyes close, trying to focus on the steam curling around me, the steady patter of water drowning out the thoughts spinning in my head. Then I saw it. Long strands of hair, dark, tangled, clinging to the wet porcelain near the drain. My stomach clenched. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be. I reached out hesitantly, fingers trembling as I plucked one of the strands free. It was too long, too thick to belong to me or Mark. It looked exactly like the burnt hair we had found on the bike. I took a step back, my breath coming too fast, my skin crawling despite the heat of the shower. This didn't make sense. I had just turned on the water. The tub had been clean. There was no way the hair had been there before. Unless it wasn't there before. Unless something had put it there. A sharp chill ran through me, prickling down my spine. The air around me felt suddenly colder, the steam seeming to hang too thickly in the air. I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking to the closed shower curtain, half expecting to see a shape standing just beyond it. I forced myself to move, to turn the water off and step out onto the cold tile. My reflection stared back at me in the fogged-up mirror, my own face pale and unsettled. For the first time since we found the hair on the bike, I let myself admit what I had been afraid to say out loud. Something wasn't right. Something had followed me home. I didn't tell Mark about the hair in the shower. Part of me wanted to, just to hear him laugh and tell me I was being ridiculous. But another part, the part that still felt cold even after standing under scalding water, knew he wouldn't have an answer. So I kept it to myself. Dinner was quiet. Mark ate like nothing had happened, shoveling food onto his plate while half watching the news. I barely touched mine. Every time I tried to focus on the TV, my mind wandered back to the long, dark strands tangled near the drain. I had flushed them away, washed every last one down the pipes, but even now, sitting at the table, I could feel them, like they had been placed there, like I wasn't supposed to ignore them. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Mark had gone to bed an hour ago, his snores muffled through the wall. The wind outside rattled the windows, the trees shifting in the darkness. Everything sounded normal, and yet I couldn't sleep. The feeling hadn't left me. It clung to, The air, that same heavy presence I had felt on the ride home. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like awareness. Like someone was waiting for me to notice them. I turned over, squeezing my eyes shut. "It's nothing. You're just tired." Then I heard it. A soft shuck against the floorboards. I stiffened, my heart slamming into my ribs. Another sound. A slow, deliberate shift. Like footsteps. Moving just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, every muscle locked in place. Mark was asleep. I knew that. The only other person in this house was me. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The air in the room seemed to shift, the temperature dipping just slightly, enough to raise the hair on my arms. The footsteps didn't come closer. They just waited. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My body screamed at me not to look, to roll over, pull the blanket over my head, pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I had to know. I turned my head slowly, eyes locked on the sliver of light under the door. And then, a shadow moved. Just for a second, passing by, slow, deliberate. I stayed frozen long after it was gone, my ears straining for any other sound, any shift in the air that might mean it was still there, but the house was silent again. Normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had walked past my door, something that wasn't Mark. And whatever it was, it didn't want to be ignored. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow moving outside my door. I heard the slow, careful footsteps on the floorboards, felt the weight of something unseen lingering just beyond the walls. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, my dreams were restless, full of dark shapes and muffled whispers that disappeared the moment I woke up. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. Almost. Mark was already in the kitchen when I walked in, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up when he saw me, frowning slightly. "You look like hell." "Didn't sleep," I muttered, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. He smirked. "Don't tell me that burned hair thing freaked you out." I forced a laugh, but it felt hollow. He had already forgotten about it. I hadn't. The unease from the night before still clung to me, but I pushed it down. Maybe I had been overreacting. Maybe my brain had twisted the sounds in the night into something more than they were. But then, as I reached for the milk, I smelled it. Smoke. Not the sharp, clean scent of burnt toast or the lingering bitterness of coffee left on the burner too long. This was different. Richer. Thicker. The unmistakable scent of burning hair. My stomach lurched. I turned sharply, expecting to see something. Smoke rising from the stove. A singed towel left too close to a burner. But the kitchen was clean. Mark didn't notice anything. He took a sip of his coffee, scrolling through his phone like nothing was wrong. I took a slow breath, my hands tightening around the edge of the counter. The smell was still there, coating the back of my throat, clinging to my skin. I turned toward the hallway. It was darker than usual, the morning light struggling to reach the far end where my bedroom door stood slightly open. A deep, uneasy chill crawled up my spine. I took a step forward. The smell grew stronger. Another step. It thickened, as if I was walking straight into the source. By the time I reached my bedroom door, the air felt different, denser, heavier, like stepping into a place that didn't belong to the rest of the house. I swallowed hard and reached for the doorknob, pushing it open the rest of the way. The smell hit me full force, and then I saw it. On my bed, tangled in the sheets, were strands of hair. Long, dark, singed at the ends. Just like the ones from the bike. Just like the ones from the shower. The glass in my hand slipped. It hit the floor, shattering. The sharp sound, jolting, me back into the present. Mark's voice called from the kitchen. "What the hell was that?" I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the hair on my bed, my pulse hammering. It had followed me, and now it is getting closer. Mark's footsteps echoed down the hall, each one slow and deliberate. I heard his voice again, closer this time. You good? I wanted to answer. I wanted to turn around, laugh it off, pretend I hadn't just seen the same burned hair we found outside now sitting in my bed like something had placed it there. But my mouth wouldn't work. Mark reached the doorway, stopping just behind me. What the hell are you? He cut himself off. I felt the shift in his posture, the way his breath stalled as he took in what I was seeing. Neither of us moved. The house was silent, the morning light filtering in through the window in thin, weak streaks. The strands of hair lay twisted against my sheets, just enough of them to look deliberate, like a message, like a warning. Mark let out a breath, low and slow. Okay, he said carefully. You tell me how that got here. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to work. I don't know. But that wasn't true. I did know. Something had followed me home. Something had been trying to make itself known from the moment we left that trail in the woods. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his usual confidence stripped away. Maybe it stuck to your clothes or something. I turned to him, my chest tightening. Does that make sense to you? He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. Mark exhaled sharply, then clapped his hands together, the sound loud and sharp in the quiet room. All right, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna get the bikes, go back to where we were riding, and check things out. I stared at him. You want to go back? His jaw tightened. I don't like the idea of something messing with us. I want to see if we missed anything. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to burn, the sheets to pretend none of this had ever happened. But I needed answers. So we went. The sun was high by the time we made it back to the trails. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, making the forest feel even emptier than before. We rode in silence, following the same path as the day before. Every turn looked the same. The dirt, the trees, the fallen leaves. Normal. Then I smelled it. Faint but unmistakable. Smoke. I pulled my bike to a stop, my heart hammering. Do you smell that? Mark was already looking around, his expression tense. Yeah. He climbed off his bike, walking a few steps forward. I stayed put, my pulse thudding against my ribs. Then I saw it. A shape, half buried beneath a layer of dried leaves and dirt. Cloth, faded, torn, like an old dress. Mark knelt down, hesitating before reaching out. He lifted a piece of the fabric, turning it over in his hands. A deep frown settled on his face. This is old, he murmured. I stepped closer, swallowing hard. How old? He didn't answer. Just stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. Let's go, he said. Now. We didn't talk on the way home. By the time we got back, the burn smell had disappeared. So had the hair. I checked the bed, the shower, every inch of my room. Nothing. It was like whatever had followed me had stayed in the woods, back where it belonged. That night, I slept for the first time in days. But something stayed with me. An image, burned into my brain. That old faded dress, and the unsettling thought that maybe, just maybe, someone had been watching us ride through the woods that day, and they had never really left.